Okay, Daniel, it's great to see you.
Very good to see you, my friend. Been looking forward to this conversation.
This is the big one. I've been looking forward to this one for quite some time. And I have to say, I spend a lot of my time looking into deep thinkers and philosophers and theories. And I have to say that your ideas are some of the deepest I've come across. So I'm going to try to keep up, but I'm really excited to dive deep today.
I've been so impressed with the um, translation that your videos have done of a number of really great thinkers, making it so much more engaging and digestible for people. So respect is mutual, and I'm happy to be here and see what comes.
Thank you. So we're going to talk about the meta crisis today and some other things. So before we begin on that conversation, I thought that maybe something that would inform the rest of the conversation would be to define game theory, because I've
Yeah,
heard you
sure.
mention that quite a bit.
Yeah, formally, game theory is a branch of mathematics that studies how to make the optimal strategic choice under uncertainty to win a game, starting with in two-player zero-sum games like chess or the Cold War. And it was formalized kind of in the World War II era. There was a book written by von Neumann, the great physicist, mathematician, thinker, and a guy named Morgenstern on game theory and economics. And it's interesting that it was those two together because so much of how our economic system works is based on the same concepts. Game theory has been happening forever. It wasn't called game theory, it was just called strategy, right? It's just we hadn't been able to apply some of the tools of math and computation that were able to be applied at that time. But if you're reading Sun Tzu or you're reading Machiavelli or you're reading any kind of general discussing military strategy, they're basically talking about how do you win a rivalrous game where you don't know what the opponent is doing. And where obviously, depending upon what they're doing, some moves would be great moves, some moves would be terrible moves. Obviously, this is chess, this is any kind of game dynamic like that. So there's the most famous first study in game theory that many people have heard of is the prisoner's dilemma. And I won't describe the prisoner's dilemma in detail here. People can check it out online. But the idea is you and a buddy are both in jail. You're both being investigated. You're both being given a kind of plea type option. If you both cooperate with not kind of ratting each other out, it's the best solution for both of you. But if the other guy rats you out and you don't, it's the worst solution for you personally. And if you end up ratting on the other guy and he doesn't, it's less bad for you than if you both kind of keep the dynamic. And so what is found out is that under the uncertainty where you don't know what the other guy is going to do, the tendency is to assume the worst and move into a position of kind of maximum selfishness, maximum rivalry. And you can imagine in situations of warfare, if you don't know how much armament the other guy has, you don't know how aggressive their interests are, you want to assume the worst case scenario and try to plan to be able to win under the worst case scenario, which ends up meaning, and the other guy is doing the same thing. If, let's say, they're offering an agreement, but you know they might defect on their agreement, which happens all the time, right? Stalin and Hitler were participating when it was serving both of their interests, and then Hitler defects on Stalin when it's not aligned with his interests. So in game theory, there's something called a coordination game, which is you actually don't compete against someone. You coordinate with them when it's in your interest to coordinate, but then you reserve the right to defect on them when that's in your interest. And not just in military situations, you see that in, say, class dynamics. The upper class might all coordinate with each other with regard to tax policies for the upper class, while simultaneously competing for who has positions of maximum power within that class. A whole industry, like, say, the AI sector or oil, might coordinate with each other for getting the regulations they want for the sector, while then all competing for who has the most market share. So under a game theoretic scenario, there is no such thing as allies for real. There is no such thing as like friends or loyalty. There's frenemies at best. And the frenemy scenario is as long as we have shared interests, I can expect a certain degree of cooperation. As soon as we don't have shared interests, I can expect defection. So we're continuously planning for selfishness and defection. And that takes up also a huge amount of bandwidth. This ends up explaining a tremendous amount about how the world works, militarily, economically, politically, diplomatically, where we're making an agreement while assuming the other guy will defect, while they are assuming we will defect. We're trying to figure out how to spy on their defection while being able to confuse their spies, and those types of dynamics are a huge amount of the coordination failures of the world. And there are some things that game theory and game theoretic thinking, even before it was formalized in math, the formalization of it just made it much more powerful and much more ubiquitous. And now you can run it on computers and run it on AI. So we can see AI being able to run those types of models beats humans at chess, beats humans at Go, beats humans at StarCraft, now is increasingly beating humans at more generalized things like obviously trading, economic trading, and even comprehensive war planning and targeting of missiles and all those things. So one type of game theoretic scenario that defines a lot of properties of the world is if there are a number of players, number of actors, let's call it tribes or countries or companies or whatever, and one of them does something that provides a lot of near-term advantage for them, it might be doing something particularly destructive. Like, say, let's take an early kind of tribal analogy. Rather than only taking what they need from nature, they're starting to cut down a lot more timber to be able to create surplus. And you have a scenario where they can then use that surplus in different ways to be able to win at tribal warfare. So now you take the other tribes. If they don't do the same thing, it doesn't protect the forest because the other guy's going to cut down the forest anyways. And if they don't do the same thing, they might not even be able to protect their people. And so now, even if they didn't want to, they have to race to cut down the forest faster just for their own need to survive. And so you get this scenario where there's kind of a race to exploit the commons. And whether that's fishing or hunting or, any kind of exploitation from the environment, oil. So you have a situation called the tragedy of the commons, which is a kind of social trap is one of the terms, or multipolar trap, where the net scenario of what everyone is racing to do makes the worst possible world for everyone, but nobody can stop it, because if anyone stops, it's so much worse for them in the short term, and they can't assure that the other guy's not going to do it. And so the idea that because they are doing it, we have to, you end up having a world that nobody wants, but nobody feels they can choose otherwise. And this is such a deep thing to understand because, let's say you take any of the major environmental issues of the time. I'm going to take climate change because probably most of your listeners think that's a thing. For those who don't, you can apply it to species extinction or chemical pollution or any of these issues. Literally nobody actually wants climate change. There's no one for whom climate change is their strategic objective. And the whole world actually, in terms of the G20, the United Nations, all of the major countries of the world have acknowledged climate change is a major issue. We all want to stop it. There's $1 trillion in climate-related funding happening every year. There's the IPCC having huge supercomputers supported by NASA and NOAA. There's international agreements. And yet every single year we use more fossil fuels than the year before. All of the renewables, all of the solar, all of everything, we haven't even slowed the rate of increase of fossil fuel use. And so we obviously don't know how to stop climate change. Everybody thinks that it's a particularly bad thing. The UN estimates that about 1 billion refugees from extreme weather events and climate change will happen in the next decade. And the world has no way to deal with 1 billion refugees. And so we can't stop it, and yet nobody wants it. What they want is energy for every other purpose, and that's one of the side effects of it. And no one feels that they could price energy properly or be able to consume less, because let's say the US priced energy properly, meaning it right now we price oil as how much it costs us to extract it from the ground plus a tiny margin, not what it took nature to make or what it would take for us to clean up the environmental effects. So obviously, most of the costs are externalized to the environment. If we were to start to try to price it more properly so that you could produce it in a way that didn't have the negative environmental effects, but say China didn't, then they would have more margins than us. They would beat us. That's the multipolar trap. And the same happens in arms races. The advancement of military tech. If they're making AI drone weapons and the AI drone weapon is going to comprehensively outperform the weapons that are run by humans, then we have to make AI drone weapons. And if we don't know exactly what type they're making, we have to assume, we have to spy on them, obviously, and we have to run counter intel on their spies. But we also have to assume that they're making all of the worst possible ones plus defenses and try to get comprehensive advantage, allocate larger and larger military budgets. And you get a world in which there is increasing destructive power with nuclear weapons, cyber weapons, hypersonic delivery of nuclear weapons, drone weapons, etc. And again, literally nobody wants to live in the world with AI drone weapons, but also no one feels that they can stop it. And so this multiplayer game theoretic dilemma where under uncertainty, you assume the worst case scenario, you race ahead. The net result is this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy is the other guy, it does do that thing, whether he was going to or not, because he thinks you're going to. And you're saying the only reason you are is because you think they are. And the world you end up getting is maximum environmental destruction, maximum weapons, maximum distrust, etc.
Yeah, it reminds me of a story where a town has no lawyers, so there's no lawsuits, and then it has one lawyer, and there's still no lawsuits, and then it gets two lawyers, and all of a sudden everybody's suing each other.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, I don't need a security guard unless you have a security guard, and then I'm wondering, is this just built into human nature? This issue?
No. And the reason you can say no kind of confidently is because there are examples of groups of humans who bound these kinds of social traps effectively for periods of time, which means human nature is capable of doing that thing. Human nature is obviously capable of doing this thing, and obviously very well, but it's not that human nature obligately does it. It's that human nature under conditioning environments does it. So this is a very important thing to understand about human nature. Let's take a look at the Jains, right? The Eastern religion that emphasizes nonviolence more seriously than most do. So much so that they really go out of their way to never hurt a bug. If they're going to build a house, they remove all the bugs first so they don't hurt any bugs. They eat fruits and nuts that fall from the plants, but they won't even kill plants to eat them. The existence of the Jains as decently large populations over long periods of time mean that you can have not just a particularly nonviolent person, but a whole culture of people that all get enculturated to live that way. So human nature allows Jains, right, as one example. But then you can also look at, say, the Janjaweed and child soldier utilizing demographic in Sudan, where by the time someone gets to puberty, pretty much everyone has murdered people. And in that environment, if you don't participate with that thing, you don't make it to puberty. And so again, you have a situation in which you can have the entire population. I'm sorry, someone knocked.
Oh, it's all good. So we were talking about the
You can have
Jains and
a
then
scenario where,
yeah.
what's that?
Oh, so we were talking about the Jains and then we were talking about child soldiers.
Yes. So you can have populations that have radically different distributions of how violent or how non-violent people are. You can have populations where the level of education is radically different, even independent of the economics. When you look at, say, the Jews in the pogroms in Russia, the way they invested in the education of the kids, even in positions of near slavery and total poverty, there was a culture kind of dynamic. So human nature, it's a very important thing to understand about human nature is that unlike all the other animals, because of our capacity for tool building, we didn't stay limited to one niche that our bodies had evolved to be able to work well in. The cheetah is amazing for one niche. It would do very bad in the Arctic. And the polar bear would do very bad in the savannah. So they stay in their niche, right? But you notice that humans moved everywhere. And humans ended up becoming like the apex predators everywhere because they were able to put on skins and build houses and change their tooling set so that they could be adaptive and actually apex predator and then environment dominating in all the spaces. So if you look at the life of a cheetah or a polar bear today versus a cheetah or a polar bear 10,000 years ago in their natural environment, what makes them adaptive is pretty much the same thing. So they get to have kind of built-in genetic code, nature for how to be that thing that co-evolved with their environment and co-evolved with their body. But what it means to be an adaptive human today versus 10,000 years ago or even 50 years ago is totally different. Most people today are not awesome at spear throwing, even though that was a super useful skill. We're very good at texting and other things. So because we change our tooling stack, change our languages, change the environments we're in, change the types of political economies we're in, we have to change our nature. We have to change deep aspects of how we perceive the world, how we make sense of the world, and how we behave. So, a key aspect to humans is a profound amount of plasticity. Because we change our environment so much, we have to kind of get, rather than hardwired, kind of like software adapted to the unique environments that we're in, which is also part of why uh, human children are kind of incapable of self dynamics, right? They're called neotenous, embryo like for so long. A horse is up walking in 20 minutes. It takes a human child a year to be walking because they don't come with the built in imprint because they're going to have to learn a language. They're going to have to learn all of these things, right? And as a result, human nature is very radically plastic. So, if we want to look at environments where there were tribes that were not only relatively more peaceful within the tribe, but relatively more peaceful between the tribes, we can see those examples. We can see them in the Iroquois Confederacy. We can see them in examples of intertribal agreement in the Aborigines, where they didn't define things via multipolar traps. They uh, came into intertribal councils, had conversations, had agreements, kept the agreements, had enforcement that worked. So, uh, is it in is it human nature that we can do game theory? Yes. Is it human nature that we must? No.
Hmm.
But when someone else starts doing it, it becomes obligate to do it or lose. And this is kind of the key thing. So it's not human nature, it's system dynamics that make it obligate. So there's a whole bunch of things that we think of as human nature because they're happening everywhere, because they're ubiquitous conditioning, because they became obligate. And so this is such an important example. So there are, on your show in particular, there are people that contest how long humans have been around. But the standard narrative is sapiens have been around 200 to 300,000 years, a pretty long time. And for all of that time, standard narrative, we were hunters and gatherers, right? Pre having the plow. In all the hunter gatherer cultures around the world, from what we can tell, they were pretty much all animistic. And anytime there's something that occurs everywhere, it's an interesting thing, right? It means it's kind of a property of evolution that arises. It is something closer to like nature.
What does
And
animistic mean?
they were related to the spirit of everything, the spirit of the tree, the spirit of the buffalo, the spirit of the river, the spirit of the moon. And so animism is the idea that everything is animated by the great spirit in some way and has their own kind of unique spirit to them. So if you study any kind of indigenous culture, the way they would, okay, we're going to hunt a buffalo and we will actually cry when we kill the buffalo. We'll make prayers. We will say that when our body goes into the ground when we die, it'll become the grass that their ancestors will eat in the great cycle of life. But there's a respect for the spirit of the buffalo, right? So when we figured out the plow, kind of the ox drawn plow, we had to figure out how to take a buffalo, domesticate it, castrate it, yoke it and uh, you know whip it all day to do that thing. You couldn't continue to be animistic, and you had to move into worldviews that were like man's dominion over nature. The animals were put here to serve us. Man was made the king of the kingdom, that kind of thing. Whereas the Chief Seattle quote, "We are not the web of life; we're merely a little strand in it. Whatever we do to the web, we do to ourselves." Those are very different worldviews. But you can't run the plow and be animistic. And not only that, but because the plow allows you to do this long row cropping, which of course, if I'm gathering, I'm not going to get anything like that. To do the long row cropping, I need a lot of land allocated to agriculture, so I clear cut a forest first. So the plow was not only the domination of the animals, but also of the land and ecosystems, right? And so a worldview arises, and this is a separate point, but that's important. Is a lot of people naively, I used to think that technology is not good or bad. It's kind of neutral. It's a empowerment. It's a tool. We can use it for whatever we want. We can use a hammer to kind of beat someone's head, but we can also use a hammer to build houses for the homeless. So a hammer is not good or bad. This is not true. Tools actually have values built into them that they end up conditioning in the population that uses them. Uh, on the Consilience Project, we wrote a whole paper on this called "Technology is Not Values Neutral." But the plow is a very good example. By you have this tool called the plow, but in order to use it, it's a totally different behavior, right? Now I am doing animal husbandry. I'm yoking and whipping an ox all day, as opposed to hunting or gathering. It's a totally different set of behaviors, a totally different worldview, a totally different conditioning of my experience and my belief. And so that tool actually ended animism, but it's important to also understand that it grew the populations because you could create a lot more caloric surplus. So the populations that had it in warfare would totally beat the other populations, which means that for any other population that was like, no, we don't want to use the plow, we think that's kind of evil and horrible, they're going to get killed in tribal warfare at some point. And or just radically overpopulated and become increasingly a smaller percentage of how the world is stewarded. So it's not only that technology ends up affecting the nature of human minds and cultures, it's that it also becomes obligate.
I've never heard that idea that tech is not neutral. I think that's really interesting, and it made me think of like the biggest inventions throughout our history, like writing or electricity. And what did those kill, or what did those,
Oh, yes. So there are great philosophers of technology who discuss this in depth with very different views. Lewis Mumford is great to read. Marvin Harris is great to read. Um, so, for instance, many indigenous cultures hold that the written word was the downfall of humanity. And that's so different than the way we think about it, right? We think about it as like one of the greatest inventions of all time that allowed us to store knowledge, accumulate knowledge, coordinate at a distance, like all these types of things. So I won't explain the kind of Western narrative of why we like written language. It's kind of obvious, but I'll describe the indigenous perspective as, so again, that written language is not that old, right? 10,000, give or take a couple thousand years. For hundreds of thousands of years, there were humans that had cultures, that had stories, that had creation myths, that had systems of medicine, that had music, that had, a whole way of being. And their intergenerational knowledge transmission, without being based on the written word, was things like at the center of the tribe was the relationship between the old people and the young people. And the old people, who had amassed the most knowledge and wisdom throughout their life, spending a lot of time with the young people, was actually what was considered the central sacred thing the tribe was doing. The kind of middle-aged people were really supporting that knowledge transmission. And so I remember a Native American describing why the written word was the downfall to me the first time. And he said, in the past, if we had an old person who had something meaningful to share rather than spend their time with a book and write it in a decontextualized linear fashion that would appeal to some people in some contexts and not others, where also the love can't be transmitted. He spent all of his time, or she spent all of her time, with kids and with young people, making sure they really got it, making sure they connected it to everything else, teaching it in a way that was unique to them, and teaching it in a bunch of different ways that allowed to make sure it was really embodied. And the kid didn't spend time as one of 30 kids in a classroom with someone paid to take care of them who doesn't actually love them and doesn't actually have that much embodied wisdom. They spent time with the people that had the most wisdom, who were totally invested in them. And so it's very interesting to think about that they would have always been learning the content in a context, right? In different contexts. If I'm learning about a tree when we're harvesting apples versus when we are seeing if there's, some bug damaging it that we're trying to protect it from, versus when we're harvesting wood versus when we're praying to the trees, versus, like, they're different contexts. We learn different things about it. So rather than here's what a tree is removed from context, that key to the nature of the teaching. So the written word linearizes thought. You have to have a beginning, middle, end of the thing. It takes a specific context and it freezes the content in that context. It separates the relationship between the teacher and the learner, right? There's all those things that it does. Now, of course, there's a lot of things that are very powerful about that. Everybody can get the same content across a huge population. It can allow for coordination, all those kinds of things. But yes, if you go through and look at all of our technology, as soon as smartphones became ubiquitous, almost everybody's sense of direction went away very quickly. And intrinsic to following the GPS tool that was super useful was no longer orienting to space and no longer creating maps of space, which is a totally different relation. It's a decreased awareness of your environment. Decreased awareness of environment is a huge part of the problems in the world. So when you start to realize that if tech is useful, you use it, that changes the patterns of behavior. That changes the conditioning of the person. If it confers advantage, everybody has to use it or they lose advantage, so it becomes obligate. Then we call it human nature.
Wow, you said a lot of things in there that really made me think. And one of them about the older generation holding all this knowledge, they're like a living library. I feel like the rate of change is happening so quickly now that in a lot of ways the younger generation looks at the older generation as this useless um, life force that's just sucking up resources and doesn't have much value to provide to them. And in some ways that's kind of right, because their knowledge is of a world that doesn't exist anymore, because change is happening so fast. They don't know how to use a touchscreen at the airport. And so yeah, are we, my question is change happening so fast now that are we not able to adapt to it? Is it getting beyond
Yeah.
us?
So a couple things. If we're in current time, if we're looking at the people that would be elders to, Gen Z and younger people, we can't really say that, call it the boomer generation, was being raised in a culture that was focused on how to grow wise elders, right? That was a thing that had already been since lost. And so if the goal of a culture is to actually develop wisdom in people, if that's its primary goal, as opposed to grow GDP, or maximize physical comforts or optionality, or game theoretic advantage, you're going to get a very different kind of old people. And so kind of since modernity, and particularly as time has gone on, the goal of developing wisdom in people has not been the goal of our educational system or our civilizational systems. In fact, with kind of the scientific revolution that gave rise to the industrial revolution, we kind of call modernity, one of the very key moments in there was kind of the Cartesian dualism. Descartes' the domain of mind and the domain of body, or the domain of objective and the domain of subjective, are completely different universes that you can't use the same methods on. The objective world third person world is accessible to the methods of science, meaning you can do measurement on it, you can do repeated measurement, you can do math on those measurements, and you can do science. But the first person world, what it feels like to be me, what my interior experience phenomenology is like, no one else can measure it, right? They can try to measure a brain activity state and correlate it, but intrinsic to the nature of it is it can be felt. First person can't be measured. So the philosophy of science doesn't directly apply. And not just first person, but the kind of I, but also the we. What is our shared interiority, our shared experience this is outside of the domain, philosophy of science. So he said, all right, that's for religion and, science over here. And there was this very famous idea that means that science can say what is about the physical world, but it cannot say what ought, because ought is not a thing you can measure in the physical world. There's some value judgments about what ought and those value judgments don't come from the philosophy of science. So the is-ought distinction, that the philosophy of science can study the physics of the world, the physics, the chemistry, the biology, etc., and understand mechanics by which it works and say what is, but it cannot say anything about what ought. And so ought then is the domain for religion. It's the domain for the application of some ethical system to law, so jurisprudence. But those systems don't have the same formalization that science does, right? They actually didn't get the same kind of empowerment at all. They got things like democracy. Well, everybody kind of weigh in on what you think ought to be. But the tricky thing is that the philosophy of science that can say what is also has an applied side, which is engineering and technology, which can change what is. And what is causing the rapid rate of change is the scientific discovery applied to technological changes that are, changing everything about the nature of not just our life, but the surface of the planet. And so what it guides, is this a good technology to build? Is this the right way to build it? Is this the right application? Should we do it or not? If there is in the philosophy of science and engineering, there is no ought. Well, you can see in market dynamics, there's nothing binding it. If you can build the thing and sell it and people want to buy it, that's it, you sell it. And then if, like, say, leaded gasoline, you sell it and you basically take one of the most toxic materials that has ever existed, that it took the biosphere 1 billion years to lock in rock underneath the biosphere so that it wasn't interacting here. We mine it, pull it up, separate the toxic lead out from the rest of the rock that was keeping it safe, turn it into a liquid, then put it in internal combustion engines to atomize it, turn it into a gas so that it goes into the atmosphere and goes literally everywhere, which is that's what we did to make internal combustion engines have not knocking. It's estimated that so the lead from leaded gasoline, we put it in pipes, we put it in paint, but just from leaded gasoline is a neurotoxin. It decreases IQ, it increases aggression, it increases psychiatric symptoms, it also increases issues with bones and a bunch of things like that, which is why it got banned eventually. But before it got banned, it's estimated that it decreased the global IQ by over 1 billion points.
Wow.
And that it increased aggression by something like 4x.
Wow.
Now, when we think about, so what was the ought that said don't do that? There was no ought. Some guys invented it. They put it out there. What the market will bear. Well, the customers want it. They don't know what the lead does, right? And so then finally, when we see how much harm it has caused, we create regulation to ban it all that time later, and all that harm has already occurred. And the same with DDT. And then and after we finally banned DDT, we just sold it to Mexico for them to use and still go into the atmosphere, and actually bought a lot of the fruit back, and then made a new pesticide that was also toxic to replace it. So you can see that the technology that is studying what is can come up with something that works for a very narrow goal. The lead did stop the engine knocking. The DDT did kill the mosquitoes, but it did a lot of other really, really horrible things. And that's where the ought side has to say, should we do that or not? Are we studying a wide enough purview of the total set of effects of this? Is this leading to a world we want or not? But the philosophy of science and the applied side in engineering doesn't have that at all, nor do the market incentives incentivize it, because if something is good for a purpose, you sell it, you privatize all of the profits from that, and it harms the environment radically and human health radically, but you're not going to be liable to pay for those costs. Privatizing the gains and socializing the losses is actually how the market works. So now, because the is-ought distinction says there is no ought to guide what should be, and in fact, when you think about the standard narrative of science is there's a Big Bang for some reason. The initial causation problem is tricky. And the constants of universe, why is the gravitational constant and the fine structure constant, speed of light what they are? We don't know. They just are what they are. And somehow they work such that stuff can emerge. And then those laws lead to self-interacting dynamics of a completely inert, unconscious universe for like 12 billion years, until you get enough natural complexity that comes out of those dynamics that somewhere on Earth biology started to emerge, and life, and then consciousness, but from a universe that is fundamentally meaningless. And if you go further, not everyone, but most people in that worldview also come to kind of that worldview, meaning kind of scientific reductionism, that free will couldn't be a thing. Doesn't make any sense, because it seems like we put somebody on an EEG or an fMRI, they describe their experience, or we put them into trying to have a certain experience. We see certain brain patterns, so we see a correlation between brain states and people's described subjective states. So then there's the assumption that that correlation is one for one, right? That every subjective experience, every thought, will, etc., has a perfect one-for-one correlation all the way down to fundamental particles in the brain. That's a big assumption, because the level of mapping we have is radically gross relative to anything like that. And then we say, well, the brain is a physical system controlled by particle physics. And the voltage from a sodium ion determines if the synapse fires or doesn't fire. And so the thing you thought was your desire or whatever obviously is not. And so you can see that there are so many places, whether it's the origin of the universe, why the constants are what they are, the fact that there was no consciousness for the vast majority of time, and then consciousness was an epiphenomena, there couldn't be free will, that the reductive physicalist paradigm is kind of meaningless. Anyways, so ought doesn't even seem like a thing that makes sense. It seems like kind of a goofy human concept from that perspective. And if there is no meaning, then like hedonism is kind of a rational perspective, in which case market dynamics and game theory and whatever. Okay. So, now if you have no system within science for what ought to be, then what ends up making the choice of what tech gets built and what science gets funded? The market does, and game theory does. And game theory, this is actually interesting to tie it back. Game theory was basically the closest thing to a scientifically commensurable theory of ought, right? What is the right choice? It's the choice that doesn't lose. So you assume rivalry, you assume a particular narrow definition of win, you assume the application of a finite game to the world. If people haven't read it, there's a really beautiful small book called Finite and Infinite Games by a man named James Carse. And it's such an important distinction, and I'll bring it up in the context of game theory here. Almost all the things we think of as games are what he's calling finite games. So if you and I are playing chess, you only win when the game ends, right? So winning and ending the game are the same thing. And that's true if we're playing checkers, Monopoly, football, anything. And so intrinsic to a finite game is the goal you're pursuing is actually the end of the game. And the idea of an infinite game that he's proposing is, we're not trying to end the game. If we're going to model life, if you're modeling life as finite games where the goal is it doesn't matter what happens other than I win and it ended. Uh, we An infinite game, the goal is to continue to improve the quality of play, the enjoyableness, the meaningfulness, the beauty of the game itself. That's a very different goal, and it's a very different decision theory. And you don't get it by maximally beating the other guy and getting caught in multipolar traps and destroying the commons. And but in finite game theory, where you're assuming everything rivalrous, then the only the ought that we really have applied to the development of technology is what will win, which is why we're in AI arms races right now, where everybody is racing for AI dominance as fast as possible at a geopolitical level between US and China and other players, at a corporate level. Even and when you're in an arms race, you don't go slow and try to make sure you're doing really the safe thing and really, test all the externalities. You don't take the risk seriously because somebody is going to get there first, and whoever gets there first has all of the first mover advantage. And so you'll deal with the problems later. And so this is actually why game theory matters so much, is it is basically the only thing we have as the currently as what is guiding all of the technological development, all of the major geopolitical strategy is a good choice is the choice that doesn't lose. And doesn't lose means in the very short term, finite game, even if it is destroying the playing field of the game for everybody.
Wow, that was brilliantly put. And you had my mind like going off in so many different directions. One thing that I think sums this up so well is there a scene in Jurassic Park, the first one, where there's all these scientists working on creating dinosaurs, and Jeff Goldblum comes in and he's not a scientist. He's kind of a goofy guy. And he's the only one that comes in and says, "Wait, the question is, should we do this?" They're all
Right.
saying, "Look what we can do. Look what we can do." And he's like, "But should we?" And they all look at him like he's crazy. But it turns out that that was a great question to ask. And
Yes.
it came from the least scientific person there, which is a good showcase of human nature right there. And
Yes.
I like what you said about how when the game's ending, everybody starts really going for self-interest because they have to. But if the game never ends, then it's about cooperation. And I think that you see this in nature where like you'll see a giant shark and it's got these little fish eating bacteria off it. And that's a symbiotic relationship. You also see it with like chimps or other animals that groom each other. There's really no benefit to yourself for grooming somebody else, but if you cooperate with them, if you groom them, they might groom you. And it's like this cooperation relationship um, that I think benefits everybody. So that you reminded me of that. And I love what you said about how science is what is and religion is kind of runs the domain of what ought. Because I think that really speaks to both the issues in those fields. Like science, in the realm of facts, science reigns supreme, but they really struggle with coming up with morals and ethics and principles. Whereas in the realm of religion, oftentimes we make fun of them for getting their facts so wrong. But in other realms, they really have it right. And that's why religion's been around for so many thousands of years, because it seems like it might be factually incorrect, but it's metaphorically correct. And
Yeah.
yeah,
And I wouldn't even say that um, science says what is. Science can explore what is exclusively in the domain of the objective, not the subjective, not the intersubjective, and specifically in the domain of the subset of the objective things that are measurable, which is not everything, and repeatably measurable. And yet, still, it is only going to tell us as much as those very small number of things we've measured so far. And if I'm observing or measuring anything, there might be a nearly infinite number of things I could observe about it. Right? If I'm trying to study the body, there's a lot of things happening in the body. Which ones do we study? And so if I get a measurement and now I say this thing is happening, that's not how the body works. That's how that tiny little molecular target works. How does the body work? We continue to discover almost every day a whole new domain of types of molecules, types of systems that we didn't even know about before. And so science can tell us only in the domain of the objective, only in very limited context, some things about what is. And so there's a humility to recognizing that. And obviously, it's still powerful enough that we can land a rover on Mars using that. And we can split the nucleus of an atom. And we can edit the genome and make new species. And we can make a large hadron collider that has pulses that are hotter than the surface of the sun. And so it's extraordinarily powerful for some things. But the insights that have been offered about anything in the domain of meaning are actually at best inferences from some things that mostly the domains of science that are focused on the limitations of science tell us, right? Things like complexity science, things like deep ecology that are looking at what the limits of reductionist science were, and the way that you have to look at not just to understand a thing, you have to understand its parts, but to understand a thing, you have to understand what it's a part of that contextualizes it and makes it that way.
Mm. Yes, you're reminding me. For many years, I worked at a psych institute that was part of a medical school. And psychiatry was kind of seen as the ugly cousin within the medical school because it wasn't as objective. And I remember there was a big insecurity in the psych institute because they wanted to be a hard science. So they really leaned into like neuroscience and neurotransmitters, and they they tried to say that mental health issues were a chemical imbalance. That's where we got that idea. And that if you're sad, it's just because your mechanics are off. And here, we just add a little bit more chemicals here and that'll fix you right up. And I
Yeah.
think that got us into a lot of trouble.
Yeah. Um, if I say that you're sad because you have some mysterious biochemical deficiency, we don't say why. We don't ask if it has anything to do with your diet or your exercise or lifestyle or anything like that. First, we assume that it's the physical body being off because that's what we study is the physical objective world, nothing about the field of your relationships or your sense of meaning or unresolved trauma or anything else. And then we first assume the mind issues from the body. Then we assume the body is just wrong for some reason that we don't know, and that an external chemical solution is the answer, and specifically a patentable one, where we will be able to charge the price that we need to make back the R&D money we had to put in to get through phase 3 clinical trials. And so from a market perspective, this is actually really important. If to make it through a phase 3 clinical trial to get FDA approval to treat disease with the thing costs a lot of money. It costs like half $500 million. And to be able to make that money back, if the thing that we studied, if the market is paying for it, if the thing that we studied now everybody can sell at the same cost as me, I'll never be able to get the R&D back. Nobody will fund the R&D. So I have to be able to patent the molecule such that I can charge enough to get the R&D money back. To patent the molecule, I can't patent things that were part of your body when it was healthy. So I have to look at synthetic molecules that we invent, which means that nowhere in medicine, when we're looking for synthetic molecules, are we studying how a healthy person works? Or are we studying you when you were healthy before this thing started? Or are we studying molecules that were even part of the evolutionary environment of people? We're studying synthetic molecules that weren't part of any healthy person and weren't part of any evolutionary environment. Like, what's the chance that that's the right way to promote health? It's just wacky, right? But if we are really trying to study health, we're going to find a bunch of things that we cannot patent and we can't profit off of anywhere near as well. And so this is the example of when you're asking, should we do that? And what are the oughts that guide how should we go about studying it? The perverse incentives built into the market, built into not just the market, but the combination between the market, the worldview of reductionism, the regulatory processes that are all self reinforcing, has that be the approach. And this is why, of course, despite all the years of psychiatry and psychiatric medicine, mental illness continues to rise, self harm continues to rise, suicidal ideation and suicide continues to rise, despite all of the work in kind of healthcare and pharmaceuticals and the fact that like healthcare is the number one area of spending for our government and deficit spending and et cetera. Obesity continues to rise, and also whole bunches of new autoimmune diseases and neurodegenerative diseases and cancers, as well as psychiatric diseases, that the curve of the rise of those diseases matches very closely to the curve of the amount of chemical pollution we put into the environment in agriculture and industry. The American Chemical Society journal lists 230 million known chemicals. And ever since the environmental movement with Silent Spring started in the 60s, recognizing how dangerous pesticides were and that they were extincting species and having huge effects, despite all the activity of the environmental movement, we've put more total pesticides into the atmosphere every single year than the previous year. And pesticides, herbicides, et cetera. And you look at the curve of the rate of like inventing things that are designed to kill the foundation of life and the foundation of ecosystems with which we co-evolved, and spraying them onto the food supply and into the atmosphere at scale. Like, that's a good idea. And then, so if we want to solve cancer right now, that's one of the arguments as to why we need to rush forward with AI, so we can use AI to be able to do genetic engineering, immuno-oncology to solve these cancers. And if you want to slow down the tech, you're a terrible person, because look at this little girl with cancer and would you want her to die? But that same technology that gets advanced for that purpose now is cheap and easy to use for all market purposes. And so now you get the bioweapons that it creates, and you get the weird designer babies and the, all the things that the AI technology does. And why is it that the energy doesn't go first to looking at why the cancer rate is raising everywhere and how to get rid of that, which is like mostly an issue of things like chemical pollution and how we do agriculture?
Yikes! So you're laying out a story of a lot of things going wrong, but I've heard you talk about this progress narrative, and there's people like Steven Pinker who are saying everything's getting better. Infant mortality is way down. People's lifespans are longer. The GDP of countries is bigger. People are becoming richer globally. Is that progress narrative? Is that completely false?
It's not completely false. It's just mostly false. Those stats are largely true as cherry-picked, decontextualized stats. So the progress narrative is the the idea that everything is getting better and better through some combination of science, technology, markets, democracy, and things like that. That's kind of the version of it in modernity. And there is a regressive history that goes with it, right? A Hobbesian view that the state of man in nature, right? The indigenous people had lives that were brutish, short, nasty, and mean. And that's our, comparison. This view definitely became like the dominant worldview in modernity, especially because when you do the Izot distinction, and then science is the thing that keeps giving you better and better weapons that win war, and better ability to increase food supply and grow markets and power and all like that. And the other areas mostly binding and asking you, should you do this? Then of course this is where you get Nietzsche's God is dead, because that's not conferring the advantage anymore. And the worldviews that confer the behaviors that win in war and win in markets are the ones that make it through. And which is a really important point I'll go back to for a moment when you're asking again, is it human nature be game theoretic? When throughout history, there have been times where there were much more peaceful cultures and then warring cultures, and the warring cultures killed the peaceful cultures, took whatever elements they had, turned them into weaponized capabilities, and continued on. And when you really study the history of that, and we can see that in relatively recent time of like, was Tibet a perfect culture before Mao invaded? No. But were they pretty lovely in a lot of ways, relatively? Yes. Were they good at building standing armies? Not really, because the worldview they had didn't orient itself to that. And what happened to them was part of history everybody knows. And the same was true with Native Americans and colonization. It's just most people don't, if they haven't studied it, don't know the extent of these things. The Americas had about 140 million human beings living here before colonization. And the effects of colonization killed 90% of them. And that's a loss of so many ancient languages and systems of music and prayer and medicine and spirituality and etc. If you ask the Native Americans, what do they think of the progress narrative? Like they can't believe that anyone would actually believe that seriously. If you ask, even if you ask most Black people, particularly ones who are American descendants of slaves, what do you think of the progress narrative? They just don't have the same view on it, obviously, right? And if you um, if you were to ask all of the species that we make extinct, and roughly there's somewhere between 10 and 30 species made extinct by human activity every day, how what they think of the progress narrative, or if you ask all the animals in factory farms, it's so obvious that we're talking about progress for a very small number of beings. But let's go back to, and a very narrow definition of progress at the expense of lots of other beings. Let's go back to this idea of um, warring cultures and peaceful cultures. So if you look at the history of the Attila the Huns and Genghis Khans and Ivan the Terribles and Caesars and Alexander the Greats and etc., and Mao's and Stalin's and Leopold's going into Congo, it's a it's a crazy history of humanity. Genghis Khan by himself is estimated to have killed 50 million people in his life. Him and his people while he was alive, not the empire afterwards, just in his life, 50 million people, which was roughly 11% of the entire global population at the time.
Yes,
And that was on horseback.
I just read that 1 in 200 people on Earth are his descendant, direct descendant.
Yes. Yeah, it's estimated that somewhere between 8 and 11% of Asians are his descendants. And so that's because, in addition to all the killing, they did a lot of raping. And that does mean that the cultures that did not mount as effective militaries didn't make it through. And the cultures that did mount those, their ideas, their cultures, their et cetera, are what made it through. And this is part of that multipolar trap of history. Now, in general, when King Leopold was going over to the Congo and doing some of the most atrocious enslavement and murder of the people of the Congo ever, to take all their stuff, he was doing it under the guise of it being a humanitarian mission to help the people of Africa. And similarly, you read all of the quotes about how we were like manifest destiny, that it was kind of like God's ordained divine right for us to take over the United States, North America, etc., and that it was a generous act that we were civilizing the savages. The extent of human motivated reasoning is really profound. The extent to which we believe and try to convince people to believe things that are directly in our self-interest that are totally ridiculous. And somewhere else I wanted to go with that.
Well, yeah, you just reminded me of a quote. The worst atrocities are always committed in the name of virtue. If you go throughout history, look at Mao and Stalin and Hitler, I mean, they all have slogans that say, oh, we're
Yes.
doing this for the common good. We're doing this to help you. and they were completely blind to. I don't think they were completely blind, but they thought that they were doing good. And often the most narcissistic, evil person thinks that their plan for the world is going to create this utopia, but really they're ignoring all the mass suffering that they're causing on the way to get
It's not
there.
necessarily that they think that it's going to cause a utopia. It's that they know that is the effective propaganda to mobilize the people. And so, yeah, this was the thing I wanted to say is the winner gets to write history. And the winner doesn't usually write the history that they were the bad guys who defected on their agreements with the other side and lied more effectively, took advantage, and did the raping, pillaging, murdering. They tell the story that them winning the war was progress, right? That Alexander was uniting all of these disparate tribes and bringing the world together. That Genghis was uniting the Mongols into a great empire. That so the history being written by the winners also leads to a progress narrative, and the wiping out of all the alternative histories of what the cost of that progress was. The cost of that progress was so much of their own culture couldn't be invested in art and spirituality and child rearing. It had to be invested in military activity and conquest and now market dominance and things like that. And the other peoples had to be destroyed. And so the root of the progress narrative is really in history being written by the winners and in kind of, at least that's a big part of the story. And then, of course, in modernity, there was a divorcing of the idea that there was much value in tradition. And new insights were particularly going to be how we move forward. And so then that became the dominant narrative rather than embedded within religious narratives.
Hmm. Yeah, I think a lot of the progress narrative comes down to just, do we have more stuff today? Are we more comfortable? I think that we're so comfortable today that if you asked anybody, would you prefer to live 50 years ago or 100 years ago? I doubt anybody would want to trade places. Like, it seems nobody with the iPhone 15 is going to go back to the iPhone 1. You know, we're just marching forward. And so we think the iPhone 15 is better than the iPhone 1. And I think possibly just having more stuff, more material, that materialist mindset is also contributing to that progress narrative.
Well, yeah, because we are the people that are the conditioned result of that thing. And we don't know what the life before was like to know how much we're missing. People who haven't spent a lot of time in deep wilderness mostly don't know how much happier they would be if they were. Mostly don't know how many of their pains and illnesses and psychological disorders would go away, how much of the striving is actually a result of emptiness from living in a environment in which we don't have intimate relationships with other people in nature. Um, if you spend time with a indigenous culture and see how much more they understand the language of all the animals, most people aren't aware of how impoverished their life is, that they don't know how to communicate to the animals, that they don't know what the whole world around them is saying all the time, and that their mind is never still and quiet. And so it's hard to feel bad about missing something you've never experienced and you don't know exists. Also, when the addict is coming down, they don't want happiness, they want a hit of the supply, right? If somebody's coming down on heroin, they don't want to see a beautiful sunset. They don't want a deep conversation with a friend. They everything else is meaningless because they have created a hypernormal stimuli that allows them to only get happiness from a very narrow thing. It's actually deadened their ability to get happiness from lots of things. And so there are reward circuits in us that are more addictive. There are other reward circuits that are not addictive, that are more actually in. So the addictive reward circuit will give you a very quick spike and then it will drop you. And then that makes a craving for another spike. And obviously sugar does this, and likes on social media do this, and using filters to look more beautiful than you are does this, and etc. Most of the things in our world do some version of this. And then in the low, then you crave more of that thing. And so you get, of course, more bipolar type experience, but you also get an erosion of your baseline over time. There's less and less things that make you happy. You more and more need those stimulus, and you need larger amounts of them. The types of reward circuits that lead to psychologically, physiologically healthy people are ones that don't give you as much spike as quickly, but raise your baseline over time. And so the type of reward you get from exercising, the type of reward you get from like meaningful conversation with friends, from helping somebody, from time in nature, you get reward circuits from those things, but they're different in kind than the reward circuits you get from fast food or from porn or from social media or those other things. But it's very hard to monetize those things on the supply side. It's very hard to sell you any of the things that on your deathbed you will say are what you wish you had spent all of your time with. Every person on their deathbed says, I wish I had spent more time with my family and with my kids and with the people that I loved, and telling them that I loved them, and working less and pursuing things less. And none of the hits that they were spending their life pursuing are at all meaningful in those reflections. But because the supply side can basically market to the addictive impulse better, and it's important to understand that, like, from a business perspective, especially once you have a fiduciary responsibility to maximize shareholder profit, you're like legally bound to that as a director of a public corporation. One of the core goals is maximize the lifetime revenue of a customer. And addiction is awesome for lifetime revenue of a customer. And so when you look at the emergence of fast food and processed foods, whether we're talking about Hostesses and Twinkies or candies or Coke or McDonald's, they're basically combinations of salt, fat, and sugar. Different combinations of that with different texture profiles that were actually scientifically optimized to maximize addiction. There were lots of split tests done to see which ones had the people crave them the most again. And yet the reason that people in an evolutionary environment, the reason that things that had salt and fat and sugar gave people more of a kind of dopamine hit was because in an evolutionary environment, pre-agriculture, those things were very rare. It was hard to get much of them. And so if you got them, there was an incentive to go find the things that were evolutionarily rare and that were useful. As soon as we make them hyper abundant, then people are dying of the excess of them. We've built a world we're not actually genetically fit to, and then exploit the weakness of that rather than try to support people to navigate it well. But it's also that those nutrients were bound with vitamins and minerals and a lot of other nutrients simultaneously. So the fast food removes all the micronutrients, optimizes those things, optimizes addiction. And so you can have people who are actually dying of malnutrition while they're obese because they're so deficient in micronutrients. And so what fast food is to food, where you just take the maximally addictive part and strip out why we were even attracted to it in an evolutionary environment, strip out all of what's good in it, is also what social media relationships are to human relationships, is also what porn is to human intimacy, is also what the news is to the desire to understand the world you live in, is what productivity is relative to meaning, right? Stripping out a very narrow, aligned with the interest of the market hit that still has that same thing, then you will feel a need for greater and greater productivity. And of course, that is great from a GDP maximizing perspective and not great from a deathbed reflections or the quality of how children are raised or the quality of the environment perspective.
Yeah, that's a really strong point there. And it leads me to some dark thoughts where I'm thinking, is our species going to select for the people that can self regulate? Meaning, are the people that can't self regulate, who do give into that porn addiction or the food addiction or all these addictions, it seems like they're just not going to pass their genes on. It's like they're just the line ends there. And the people that can say no to those things are the ones now that are going to be able to find romance and say no to all that porn and say no to all that sugary food. The people that can control their dopamine and their impulses are going to find each other and pass their genes on.
Mm,
It's like a filter.
mostly not. There's a few cases where what you're saying is true. Of course, if someone has a level of drug addiction or food addiction that makes them so unfit for a relationship that they never get in a relationship, then sure, that could be the case. But um, in general, the selection criteria is largely has been going the other way. As we were mentioning, it was the Mongol genes after the killing and raping that made it through, not the other ones. And it's the populations, it's the places that are willing to pump more oil, do more mining, destroy the environment faster that can grow their populations faster. Um, this is one of the classic examples is, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, there were about a half a billion people, 500 million people in the world. And that was after 10,000 years of civilization, right? Roughly 13,000 from Göbekli Tepe, whatever length you want to say. And it was after 200,000 or 300,000 years of human beings, about a half a billion people. And then in the last couple hundred years of the Industrial Revolution, we went from half a billion to 8 billion. Like 200,000 years to get to half a billion, 200 years to go from half a billion to 8 billion. And in the industrial world, in the developed world, what we call the developed world, the resource consumption per capita went up about 100x during that time. That doesn't mean you ate 100 times more calories, but your life depends on 100 times more calories to make the light bulbs and the internet and the car and everything work in the form of fossil fuels and whatever that support all this. So beyond just your body calories, about 100x the resource consumption per capita. And the Industrial Revolution level at the beginning of that was already high relative to earlier times. So that's a 1600x increase in unrenewable extraction from the environment and pollution over a very short period of time. And corresponding with that, we see that the population of wild animals, the ones that aren't extinct, has gone down 70% globally everywhere just actually compared to 1900. And one of the most mind-blowing stats is when it comes to mammals, only 4% of all the mammals in the world are in the wild. 95% of them are in factory farms. So we have that many more animals in factory farms in the entirety of the wild, like to have a sense of how big our impact on the world is. So there were many reasons that our population boomed in the Industrial Revolution. And this is all the progress story, right? Look at how many more people there are and all the things we have. But the side of the progress story that isn't being told is just like the victor story in war is not telling the story of the other side or all of its own soldiers that died or etc. The progress narrative post-industrialization is not telling the story of the animals in the factory farm or the extincted species or the rising turbo cancers and autoimmune diseases and things like that. But the main technology that increased the population was the Green Revolution, Haber-Bosch, and the development of synthetic fertilizers. And it allowed us to take a bunch of soil that wasn't arable and spray a fertilizer on it that would grow crops so that you could grow a lot more crops in a lot more areas. And that was starting with the beginning of nitrogen, the ability to create synthetic nitrogen. And then we ended up adding two more things to that, phosphorus and potassium. So that's called NPK. People probably heard about NPK fertilizer. So that supported this massive population boom. But it also supported being able to turn lots of forests that wouldn't have been worth cutting down because the soil wouldn't have been that arable, and lots of meadows and lots of other places into agriculture land for people. The NPK, as it's sprayed on the soil, as opposed to compost going back in the soil, is only putting back those three minerals. not the 72 minerals, not all the organic matter, not everything else, which can grow a plant that is very micronutrient deficient in comparison, which is almost all the plants we get. It's the runoff of that into the river, into the ocean, that causes all the dead zones in the ocean. So at the beginning of Haberbosch, there were no dead zones in the ocean. It's a 3/4 water planet. The animals live in the ocean. Life started in the oceans. There's over 500 dead zones around the world, massive areas of ocean where nothing can live, that are the result of that runoff. The microbiome of the soil is destroyed when that's put in, which affects the genetics of the plant, and the nutrient uptake, which affects our genetics when we take it, or our genetic expression at least. And so, again, that it's like one of the greatest stories in the progress narrative, that we got this method allowed us to get all these people. But if you look at the total set of harms that have come associated with that, you're like, was that the best way to do it? Should we have tried to maximize the number of people, and how much were we decreasing the quality of life, the authentic quality of life? So, as the longevity went up, mostly because of infant mortality going down, the morbidity in many ways has also been going up. So yes, there are people who are making it to 80, but they're on average on 11 different prescription meds. Some of those are the side effects of the other meds they're on. They cause a really not awesome quality of life in lots of ways, as well as the externalized cost of the not awesome quality of life for everyone else. When you look at the fact that those curves, whether it's pollution in the environment or species extinction or any of the things, are on still exponential curves crossing planetary boundaries, we don't get to keep doing this thing very long. So our idea of progress has come from a very narrow method of defining, right? Our idea of progress is, we define this problem in this super narrow way. Can we grow more food? Not is it good quality food? Not will it not destroy the environment? Just can we grow more food? Which from the market perspective, being able to sell it obviously made sense. Can we sell food that people buy more of? Doesn't matter. We're not asking don't do obesity and help people's health, but Twinkies totally up to that particular thing. So the progress narrative focuses on narrow areas of progress without looking at all the externalized costs of that. And so you can't really consider that. I think that's a ridiculous definition of progress. It's a very immature, at best, generously and immature, if not actually just propaganda. For it to really be progress, it doesn't just mean advancement in technology, the level of is. It has to also be that it's actually better, like more good, which the philosophy of science isn't enough to tell us. And you can't put into metrics because you can't measure it. So it requires a different relationship to how we make choices. For us to be having authentic progress, it means the world is actually becoming a better place. So for that, we have to say better for whom? Is it better for everybody, including the other species that we inhabit with? And what is our definition of good? Is it becoming better in the definition of people's deathbed reflections are noticing a life full of much more meaning? Or is it becoming like, when you look at GDP as a metric, obviously war drives GDP to go up. And addiction drives GDP to go up. And sickness that's treated with medicine that could have been prevented causes GDP to go up. And so is GDP a good measure? Like, it's a ridiculous measure, obviously. And so for us to, and we said that the finite game, you win when, and it ends. And we're definitely on a path where the continuation of our win orientation will actually end the possibility of civilization continuing on this planet. To not have that happen, we actually have to redefine and really rethink about progress, meaning factoring all the externalities. Is this still good? Should we do this thing? Right? Factoring the total set of things. No ability to privatize gain and socialize loss, really saying, factoring the whole set of things, is this a good thing to do? And rather than be bound in multipolar traps, find a post-game theoretic relationship to, if it is not actually progress for everybody, then it's not going to be progress for anyone, because it's just going to drive arms races. You get a momentary uptick in your security that makes others insecure. So they reverse engineer the thing and scale it up, and the wars just become more dangerous.
Hmm. One area that I've paid close attention to is the birth rate, and the population is not growing anymore like it was. It's looking like we're going to peak in about 2100, and already countries like Japan and Korea are they're going way down. They're losing exponentially more people every year.
Yeah.
And so our population's still going up. It's going to go up for another couple decades, but we are plateauing. Is this kind of a natural course correction, you think?
Um, I think that's a fair way to see it. The decreasing birth rate is partly cultural, but it's also largely physiologic, right? It's partly cultural in that when specifically women have more education and economic opportunity, they usually don't choose to have as many kids. And so that's a part of the story. But a huge one of the kind of morbidity increasing things is decrease in fertility. And the decreasing fertility throughout the whole developed world does again correspond pretty closely to things like the rise of glyphosate use, the rise of pesticide use, um, and other things that are debasing the physiology and its capacity to reproduce healthfully. So, is that a corrective? Population is a very complicated topic. You'll hear people like Peter Zion talking about demographic collapse as one of the most serious issues that we're facing. It's true that if we have lower population, it will cause massive problems to our world system. Because if you have less young people coming into workforce and you have more old people that can't work but are need retirement accounts, the economics of the system start to become really tricky. The other side of the population story is that before the plow and the beginning of us starting to clear cut whole areas, there were only like 30 to 50 million people. And before the Industrial Revolution and the capacity for industrial scale extraction faster than the regeneration of the resources, there were only 500 million people. And that the curve of human population and the curve of other animal extinctions map pretty close to one to one. And so we built a human system, right? A market, geopolitical kind of human system that was predicated upon exponential population growth, which obviously couldn't happen forever. It was predicated upon exponential economic growth because you have to have exponential economic growth of this financial system to just even keep up with interest. Because next year, there have to be all the dollars there are this year globally plus interest. And since the interest is on a compounding curve, that means an exponential demand for capital growth. And since that capital to not be debased has to relate to goods and services, that also means an exponential demand for energy use. There's a 99% correlation between global GDP and global energy use, and also material use, which is why the GDP curve and the material extraction curve and energy use curve are nearly identical in shape. Obviously, on a finite planet, you don't get to do that forever. And yet, every bit of how our system works requires that because it was built upon a situation in which that growth curve was happening. And yet, it was fundamentally incompatible with the biosphere. So we have a situation now where our civilizational system and the biosphere are incompatible with each other. We can't change the laws of physics of how the biosphere works. So if we continue this thing as long as we can and try to continue it, we will end up destroying the biosphere that we depend upon. And to not destroy the biosphere, we actually cannot maintain the fundamental logics of this system. You cannot continue exponential GDP growth, can't continue exponential population growth. That means you're going to get demographic inversion for a while before you find stable state type populations. And these are some of the unprecedented challenges that we face currently.
Hmm. Yeah, it's almost like our biology is rejecting our species at the moment. Um, I was just
Our
in
biology is
Japan.
what?
Our biology is, because we're so many people are now infertile. The sperm count is plummeting.
Yeah,
Miscarriages are skyrocketing.
yeah.
Even things like erectile dysfunction is off the charts. Many young men are having trouble, and it's almost like our biology is saying, "All right, I'm going to press the off switch. You may want to pass your genes on, but we're going to say we're going to put this to a halt just for the sake of the Earth." But I'm wondering, is the planet really the boundary? Like, if the population gets so big, it puts pressure on us to go outward into the cosmos. We then have to extract off of asteroids and things like that. Is that, are we going to be forced to do that?
Well, that's obviously one of the dominant stories and focuses right now. Is um, we are using up all the resources of this planet, turning them into trash and pollution. And rather than figure out how to solve that, let's just extend that to the rest of the universe. Um, I think that that's one of the most kind of gross worldviews, like so not beautiful. Um, uh, I also think there's no chance that will happen. Just uh, kind of in terms of the scientific technological curves, the time scales at which we destroy this are so much sooner than the time scales at which we become really effectively interplanetary at the current rates. And so, uh, whether we are to become interplanetary in the future or not, if that is to be a possibility, I think the only chance of that being viable is based on getting the dynamics here right first. Obviously, there's a lot of energy that is going into us mining asteroids and mining the moon and becoming interplanetary species. Yes, I would totally love to see that energy reinvested in creating a viable civilization here instead. The other escape route is test realism, right? Is AI and programmable matter and the singularity approach. You were actually talking earlier about is do we have a situation where older people are not actually very useful to younger people because the rate of technological change in the world is so different? And insofar as if we had a culture that was developing wisdom, one, it might not promote all of the technologies and allow for all of the technologies. One thing that's very interesting is when you look at various definitions of wisdom, they almost always involve the concept of restraint, what not to do, and which is not a thing that is really a concept in our market or definitely in all the game theoretic scenarios. So if we had a culture that was emphasizing wisdom, um, even if the technological environment changed, there's a lot about wisdom that is transcontextual that would still be transferable. We didn't do that. But we're also in a situation where the technological singularity, the rate at which technology is increasing, is such that even young people can't keep up with the rate of it. And so Kurzweil's idea of the singularity, the rate at which technological change is so fast that by the time you're adapting to a new technological change, it has already been obsoleted. And the new technologies that are the most dominant are coming out faster than humans can adapt. So humans are no longer adaptive in the technosphere. The rate of information creation is such that no one can be an expert on anything because there's more information being created than anyone can know. In some ways, we've already passed the information and technological singularity. And so the answer that, uh, unfortunately, most of the money of the world is following right now is accelerationism. Is we're in this multipolar trap, we can't stop it. So the only thing that could possibly, we're not smart enough to understand all that and to adapt fast enough. So maybe an AI will be. So whoever builds the first AGI is going to be what runs everything. Maybe whoever is the one that builds it, either because they can do a brain computer interface or they can do a whole brain emulation upload of their consciousness to the cloud, or because they can keep the AI working for them or something, they will have that kind of first mover advantage. And so if you look at, um, Microsoft is a $3 trillion company, which is amazing, right? That means that their market cap is more than the GDP of almost every nation in the world. And if you look at the top like 11 companies right now, 7 of them are basically have AI as their main play. And um, so you have all these trillions that are invested in the US have to beat the Chinese at AI supremacy, and the Chinese have to beat the US. The various companies are all competing for AI supremacy. And you'll see Sam Altman make jokes like, oh, it'll probably kill everybody, but it'll make a lot of shareholder profit in the meantime. Like openly make those jokes. And there's this weird world we live in where people are like, okay, let's just keep kind of going with that. And so the other answer to this that is being pursued that I think is even crazier than, all right, so we destroyed this planet, let's get off and get to other planets, is um, let's create a digital god that can solve all the problems. And even if our creation of it risks absolutely everything, um, and is driving all the problems to be worse in the process.
Oh boy. It seems like these problems and these issues are so large that myself and the average person, it's just like it's too big for us to even wrap our minds around. So we might as well just keep living, keep following our impulses. Like how do you get people to care about these massive existential crises when their own personal problems are so much more urgent and real?
They're not. A few years ago, the people in Kiev thought their normal day to day issues were the most critical thing. That obviously changed for them very rapidly. Kiev was a very progressive city. A lot of people in the blockchain community were moving there because it was one of the places that was like a hub for decentralized computing. Israel was one of the most kind of technologically, economically advanced places, and we see the dynamics that are happening there. Collapse can start to come to a place. It's so easy if we're not in the place where collapse is happening to think that it won't ever happen because we don't have an experience of it, so we don't have an intuition for it, even though the history is that every empire in the history of the world collapsed. That right before it collapsed, it was usually at its height. That the people at that time didn't think it was going to happen, so they weren't doing any smart kind of guidance or preparation. They were continuing to live in the way that advanced what caused it to collapse directly. So we can be more foresightful than that. It would be nice if we were more foresightful than that. And I'm saying that the timelines of the issues facing the world are such that if people are paying attention right now, they will realize there are things that are much bigger issues than the things you're dealing with in your current life that are impending, that orient really deep life reconsideration. The next thing is if people haven't, everybody should go study the Ash conformity studies and the Milgram experiments, which I'll just recap very briefly. Milgram experiments, fascinating behavioral psych done at Stanford, where people were brought in to be part of a scientific experiment. They were told that the experiment had to do with the effects of like electroshock therapy on people. There's a person on the other side of the wall who was going to be receiving a shock. They just had to push the button of the level of shock the scientist was monitoring, and what they were trying to do is understand the effect of electric shock. The reality was the person pushing the button was the test case. The person on the other side of the wall that they couldn't see wasn't actually hooked to electric shock. They were an actor, and every time the button was pushed, they made a noise accordingly. But the people in the study obviously didn't know that. That's why the study worked. And so the scientist, the authority in the situation, said, okay, go ahead and do the shock at this voltage. And they would hear on the other side a groan. And then they'd turn the voltage up and say, now do it. And then turn the voltage up. And the person screams on the other side. And the person who's pushing the button is like, is this okay? Are they all right over there? And the scientist is like, yes, everything is okay. This is what we have to do. This for science. And a humongous percentage of the people continued to push the button because the authority told them to the point that they actually believed it was killing the person on the other side. And the Asch conformity studies are where a whole group of people were all tested together about which line is longer, and they'd put a few lines, or which color is darker, or something like that. And everybody in the group was an actor except one, but that one person didn't know that. They thought everyone else was part of the study. Everyone else said this line is longer, but it was obviously false, right? Like the other line was longer. And a very high percentage of people uh, had their answer match with what the group said. Some people had their answer go against what the group said, even when the group said the right thing, because they were disagreeable. So rather than actually observe reality themselves, a lot of people either went with the group or disagreed with it as the basis of their action, but went with it was particular interest. So going with what the authority dynamic is, going with what the kind of group dynamic is. So when the Nazis were being tried in the Nuremberg trials for war crimes, this was one of the most fascinating things, because like how, when we were talking about population wide dispositions, the Germans were not always genocidal people, right? And so it's like, how did it happen that relatively quickly a population of people who were moral human beings, who loved their children, who, you know, were normal people, were now at mass throwing kids in gas chambers? And when they were asked, did you believe that everything you were doing was good, 90% of the Nazis said no. They said, at first we did, but we were just bringing the people to the camps. We weren't going to exterminate them, and et cetera. And it got worse and worse and worse. And by the end, like, no, we didn't think it was good. And then they were asked, did you try to stop? And all of them said, no, we didn't try to stop. And when asked why, they all quoted the same German phrases that translate to officers' orders. I didn't really have a choice. When people don't feel like they have a choice, they can be complicit with evil, even if they are not actually evil. When people say, there's nothing I can do about the world situation, it's the same thing. But rather than the Nazis, it's the distributed system that they're being complicit with. All right, well, I'll just keep doing all the things that the system is disposing me to do, buying all of the things that I want on Amazon, having them delivered to my door, and pursuing the cultural status things that marketing tells me to pursue, and etc. Rather than unplug from that thing and say the Krishnamurti quote, that it's not a good measure of mental health to be well adjusted to a profoundly insane society. If my society is causing the extinction of 10 to 30 species every day, if it is increasing the chemical pollution to the point that everybody's becoming infertile and having autoimmune diseases and cancers and neurodegenerative diseases, if it is rapidly building the most horrifying kinds of weapons possible in arms races, is that a sane society? No, it's a fucking batshit crazy society. Do I want to be complicit with it? Am I willing to be complicit with it? Am I willing to have my spot in the history of the world be at the time when human choice mattered more than any other time? Because previously, you could have the fall of a Roman civilization, or the fall of the Ottoman, or the fall of the Egyptian, vast civilizations, but it still wasn't everything. They were still local civilizations. And you did have civilizations that actually fell because of environmental overreach. That was actually quite common. And the overstripping the environment and your civilization failing is a multi-thousand-year-old story. So you can read books like The Collapse of Complex Civilization by Joseph Tainter that show one of the reasons civilizations collapsed. They'd cut down all of the trees, the topsoil would erode, they would lose agricultural capability, and then they'd stop being able to feed the people. So we've been, Iceland used to be covered in trees. There's no trees. The Vikings destroyed all the trees. The thing that we think of as Iceland is not Iceland. It's Iceland post deforestation. some of the great deserts of the world were the results of early human activity that desertified them. And so, but when we destroyed the environment, it was always just a local environment. It wasn't the biosphere, right? It wasn't the chemistry of the oceans writ large, the atmosphere, the amount of genetic integrity of how many species of soil microbes there are, things like that. There's a study that came out about 6 months ago on PFAS, the fluorinated surfactants, which are basically like, you know, Rain-X and Scotchgard and the stuff that we spray on everything. That PFAS is found in rainwater everywhere in the world. It was found in freshly fallen snow in Antarctica. It's found in rainwater on every continent. That means there's just one category of pollution that we have made so ubiquitous that if you're off grid collecting rainwater to try to not be part of the system, it's filled with PFAS. And it was at PFAS that was at many times higher than the EPA allowable levels everywhere in the entire world. That's having biological effects, not just on humans, the infertility things, but on the soil microbes, on the algae, on everything, right, on the whole planet. So if you see that we're at a time where we could, that the precedent of history is at civilization's end, and they end for reasons that they helped cause. They end for reasons that had to do with self-termination. And even if you say, well, they were beat by someone else, usually it was also that they engaged in rivalry that engendered those types of dynamics with the other people. And oftentimes they got large enough that they got internal infighting and erosion of how their government worked because of corruption and things like that. Many of the civilizations that fell to opponents smaller than ones that they had successfully defeated earlier because they had already went through internal decay. So the precedent is civilization's end. Their own growth plays a major role in their own end. But for the first time in history, we have a single global civilization where all of the products we depend on take 6 continent supply chains to make. There is no Chinese civilization and US civilization. And all the US stuff depends on Chinese stuff, depends on cobalt that comes from the DRC in Africa, depends upon oil that comes from the Middle East, et cetera. And so all the manufacturing of our needs comes from a global civilization that is in the same process of self-termination. It doesn't have to go that way. We could go a different way with it. You can imagine that none of the Nazis wanted to defect, because if they defected, the idea was they would be killed, right? If they could coordinate and all defect, then there wouldn't have been the genocide in the first place. The ability for people today to realize that the trajectory of the world that we're on is not the trajectory that they want, that they are not willing to be complicit with, that the possibility of changing it is a more potent possibility for meaningful contribution than anyone has ever had in terms of scale. And that that's a more worthy use of their life and attention than whatever's currently engaging it. That, I think, is the only sane assessment.
I love everything you just said, and I'm wondering, is this a privileged worldview though? Like, it's hard to go to somebody in a developing nation who's burning fossil fuels just to stay warm, or they're it's hard to go there and say, hey, just stop fishing. You're overfishing here, when they're just trying to survive. We've built our civilization up to a point where we're not living in that survival mindset. Jordan Peterson, his theory is that you got to make everybody rich, and then they start to care about the environment. What do you think about that idea?
Indigenous people who didn't even have fiat systems of money all cared about the environment. So, like, there's so many of our thoughts on sociology that are looking at ubiquitous conditioning post-industrialization. And because it's ubiquitous conditioning, certain dominant systems won, then we do all of our social studies on these people that were conditioned this way, and then we call it human nature. And if we were to look at indigenous people, that were, of course, how everybody was for all of human history, and there's a lot of variance in it, they fall outside of all of the sociological bell curves. But we just call those statistical outliers, are so. Do you have to be rich to care about the environment? No. Is it harder to care if you are in abject poverty? Yes. Indigenous cultures weren't in abject poverty. They didn't have a lot of surplus, but they had a relationship with they were able to provide for themselves in relationship with nature in a way that was sustainable. Poverty is actually a result of uh, the thing we call civilization. That's actually a really important point is when you start to create large cities, right? Sumeria, Babylonia, Egypt, etc., the early empires. Now you have a scenario where people are being trained in specialist activities so that you get division of labor and more total things happening. So people are all dependent upon this overall system, and no one has self-sufficiency or even small scale like tribal sufficiency. And that system is in a process of unsustainable growth and game theoretic dynamics with other places. And so, you know, before colonization, Africa was not a place of rampant poverty, right? Africa was a place of rampant poverty after colonization, after destroying the people's cultures, kind of enslavement, uh, environmental damage, moving people from the arable land they were in, so many things like that. And so that logic itself is actually part of the perpetuation of the existing system that says, okay, you have to have everybody grow up in the economics of this system. Well, if you tried to give everyone in India and Bangladesh and China and Nigeria a US or UK quality of life in terms of resource consumption per capita, there is no way to do that. We are already past ecological tipping points with already that not being the case. And so I'm not putting the burden of thinking about how to change the world system on the people who were put into poverty by the world system. Most of your listeners are probably not in this place. Many of your listeners might feel that they're working hard to pay the bills, but they also probably, when they get a chance, increase their cost of living in a way, and continue to increase their cost of living as they're capable of producing more, such that their time stays bound to money making, and such that they continue to feel that they have to work and be part of the system all the time. But one of the gifts in my life was, I think some mentors told me this early, was I kept my cost of living extremely low, such that I kept the amount of my time allocated to supporting my existence very low. So I got to have most of my time allocated to studying the world that I was in and thinking about what was meaningful and engaging in it in a way that was not market bound. I want to say something about progress.
Yes. Yes.
If you think about human life depending upon all of these species and this biosphere and this ecosystem that took kind of billions of years of evolution, the amount of work that nature put into creating a world that we can exist in is mind-blowing, right? Like the amount of, if you want to call evolution, the amount of like design and iteration and work that had to happen to get a world that we can exist in is mind-blowing. It's reasonable that a huge percentage of our attention would go to maintaining and protecting that. As opposed to just the topic of advance. If advancement is much more interesting than maintenance, advancement is much more interesting to egos in particular, to the things that we get to take credit for. Very few people make the history book for maintaining the world. But most of life should actually be about maintenance. And you look at the I mean, this is a key part of the division of labor between men and women, is that in householding, feeding the kids, you wash the dishes and they get dirtied, and then you wash them and then they get dirtied, and you make food and then it gets eaten, and you make food and it gets eaten. And so you don't actually get to make the history books for that. And yet it's the foundation of everything. And um, so I think a huge part of a healthy culture puts an incredible value on ma- maintaining and stewarding the unbelievable gift that existence is, and realizing that it takes work to maintain and steward. And so progress is actually not the main focus. The main focus is actually appreciation of what is and honoring and relating to what is well. Maintenance on the doing side is a huge amount of the activity. Obviously, all the examples we're giving where we made progress that caused harm other places is not doing that, right? It's causing radical harm to in a very small number of years and decades to what took nature billions of years to make. And when we make a species extinct that was the result of billions of years of evolution, we make them extinct quickly and we can't ever get them back. And if we destroy a culture where their language took thousands of years to evolve and then they're gone forever. It takes a long time. It takes decades to grow an adult human being, but you can kill them in a second. Destruction is fast. And as a result, maintenance and protection should be a very high value, because you can also grow things fast that are also destroying other things that are outside of the field of where your market incentive or what your, purview of your jurisdiction, what you're supposed to be focused on is. It's not just market incentive. I remember one of the first times I started engaging with kind of government organizations, my very early 20s, talking to people at the World Food Program about how to solve world hunger. And they had an approach that brought NPK based agriculture to the developing world and did a whole lot more agriculture in those places, so that you didn't just have to ship food to them. And I said, that approach will accelerate the dead zones in the oceans very rapidly, which will accelerate the uninhabitability of the entire planet. And they said, that's right. I guess that's true. We hadn't thought of that. But ultimately, oceans are not the metrics we're tasked with. The metrics we're tasked with are how many people we're feeding per year right now. And so it's not just the perverse incentive of the market, it's also the choice making architectures that divide the world into parts and think you can optimize a part without thinking about its relationship to everything else in a universe that's actually radically more interconnected than that. The other thing is, not only did this world take so much to create that we want to maintain, but also to just enjoy and appreciate. A meaningful human life has a lot of time just in awe of sunsets and trees and animals and children and stars, and if the goal is to make stuff better, to make stuff better, to make stuff better, and it never grounds in the actual experience of the beauty of what is, who cares, right? So a huge percentage of right life should not be oriented to progress, but actually taking in like awe and gratitude the beauty of what is. So much of our progress impulse is because we don't have that. And so there's an emptiness that wants to fill itself with the addictive hit of progress, right? I'm getting ahead, I'm growing, I'm getting better, I'm inventing a new thing, I'm, whatever. And a lot of the progress impulse is pathological result of emptiness. Now, there is a healthy type of progress that's also important, because taking in the world as it is, that mode of being, is the foundation. It's the foundation of why anything matters at all, is because we actually have experience. The depth of our experience of the meaningfulness of life is why anything matters to then want to protect, maintain, or add to. But we are also creative beings, and we want our creation to add to the beauty of the world. So first we want to take in the beauty of the world. We want to protect and maintain it, and then we want to add to it, but where it really adds to it, right? Add to, meaning in harmony with all that is. Otherwise, it's not going to add to it. It's going to add something and destroy other things. And it may be destroying things that are more fundamental and more meaningful. And so it is important that we have a sense of progress that comes from a depth of being and fullness, so that we're not trying to get all of our happiness from progress. There's also so much about the way kids are raised where them learning more is where they get their rewards, and them, gaining new. It's the combination of that with, they're progressing in their studies as the main place of where they get their reward, with not enough depth of real intimacy and unconditional love that creates a doing over being emphasis, right? Another part of that that's so significant is that in most kids growing up, most of the times they were rewarded was for doing something somebody else wanted them to do, doing something that the teachers, parents wanted them to do, and getting an answer other people had already figured out. And most of the times they were punished or told they were wrong were for answers that made sense to them or things that their own sensibility wanted to do. And so if you want to train Ash conformity into everybody, and Milgram conformity into everybody, that's a good way to do it. It's not a good way to train people how to actually think, how to discover, and how to make good choices on their own. Where was I right before this? I wanted to come back and
We were
close that
talking
loop.
about schooling and incentives and maintenance rather than progress.
Yes. So if Marshall Rosenberg invented nonviolent communication, was someone I got to study with, and it was so beautiful to watch him talk about how he worked with kids and how he taught kids. He said, when I'm teaching kids, say math, and the kid gets what we would call the right answer, I don't praise them for getting the right answer, and I don't punish them for getting the wrong answer. We just talk about the right and wrong answers independent of their kind of sense of validation. So like a kid rushed to the front of the classroom as the first one finishing a math assignment, could tell that he rushed to the front of the classroom and was the fastest one because his parents or whatever had been ingraining you need to get all the right answers and be the fastest at it. And rather than say, oh, look, you got them almost all right and one wrong, good job, you got a 99%, but then also the pain on the one wrong, Marshall looks at it and says, I get the same answer as you for all of these ones except this one. I got a different answer on this one. Can you walk me through how you got that one? And then the kid self-corrected it and said, okay, we got the same answer on all of these. Cool. But then has a deep expression of the love of the kid when he sees what they are, like their authentic self expressing itself, not just them getting the right answer on things. Because then that kid might start to love math, even though they don't really love math, just because they figured out how to get reward circuits on it. So the type of progress that comes from a sense of fullness of what is and desire to appreciate, protect, maintain, and add to what is a much healthier one than the one that comes from the desire to fill an emptiness. Then it is important that we actually believe that we can have the activity of our life leave the world better for others. That's the authentic, meaningful part of the progress narrative, that I've got to experience a tremendous amount of beauty. I want to leave the world at least as beautiful, not worse, and ideally more beautiful for others. And that's such an important sacred impulse that I want to rescue that from the propagandized version that says because you grew GDP or because you got a new product or market out there, a product to market, or because some new piece of technology was advanced, even if it's used to destroy lots of things, that's progress. It's the reality of what authentic progress would be, which is I actually left the world better. Better requires meaning we can say something about good and ought, not just is. And better for whom? A more inclusive definition that includes everybody, future generations, not just my people, but all people, not just people, but other beings. And a deeper definition of what is actually meaningful, which is going to ground in the basis of the depth of experience. And so I want a world where people feel that they can add to progress, where there is something sacred about the way we think of progress. And because it is so sacred, a bastardized version of it is totally not okay, right? The bastardized version of it is a sin. It's like, no, no. The idea that we are unbelievably gifted to exist in this world at all, we want to honor and protect that. And that we were endowed with creative capabilities. We want to use those creative capabilities to leave that kind of gift for others. That I actually want people to hold how sacred that progress impulse is and make sure that all the ways they add to the world actually meet that definition.
Mm. Daniel, there's so many ways I want to go with this conversation, but I'm curious to know how you came to these ideas. Were like psychedelics a part of your mind expansion or meditation? Like what brought you to this way of thinking? I'm not trying to derail us on this conversation, but it seems like there's a like a spiritual flavor to some of the things, and I'm wondering where that came from.
Hmm. It's many different things. I'll say a few. Um, One thing that was really a very fortunate experience when I was a kid, my mom took me to do a lot of activism work of many kinds and volunteer work. And one of the types of volunteer work was we'd go to old folks' homes and spend time with the people there and just talk and listen to their stories. Um, and particularly, we'd find people who didn't have family members who were coming to visit and kind of adopt them as grandparents and visit them often, and sometimes bring them over to the house. Um, and I got to have the experience of being with people who were literally on their deathbeds and shared their deathbed reflections many, many, many times as a, you know, as a young kid, and that was super impactful because there were patterns that the people shared that were very noticeable, and they said roughly like, "There's a way that I am reflecting on what was meaningful now that death is imminent that I never could before." Because before I was always still focused on the obligations of what I had to do next and what I still wanted to do. So I was not purely backwards looking. And so I didn't go as deep into that. And as I don't have a chance to do any more things in the future, and I'm just reflecting on what was most meaningful, there are insights that come up. And, um, there are lots of articles that say number one regret of the dying that different people have said different things, and it has a lot to do with the questions you ask that frame them. But as I was there listening, the one that stood out the most by far of the regret of the dying was that they didn't express their love to everyone around them enough. That they were like, I so wish I would have told my kids how much I loved them, how proud of them I was. I wish I'd have spent more time with them. I wish I'd have told my parents more things. And it was where they really hurt. It was where they had remorse and pain facing death and felt that they had lived wrong. Um, the other thing was, the second thing was that the things that felt most important and meaningful to them, they put off because of the things that they felt like they had to do. And that was their next biggest source of regret, was that their life didn't align with their own values as much as they wish it had. And um, so that was very impactful. And I never saw any of them say that they wished they had spent more time with their work and their productivity. I didn't see any of them say the highlight of their life was the things they bought, or their accomplishments. Actually, their highlight of their life was always moments of love and intimacy in ways they had been able to do something meaningful for people and things like that. And so it was very striking how different their reflections on what mattered were from how everyone continued to spend their whole life, and what the market optimized for and what the state optimized for and what education optimized for. It was almost perfectly optimized for lives full of regret. So that was one thing. I did not want to make the exact same mistakes that it was easy to see so many people had as the most fervent thing they could offer to a young person was, please don't make the same mistake. I'm like, okay, I get it. Also, being engaged in activism of other kinds, I got to see a factory farm very young. And, I grew up eating meat without thinking about where it came from, while also having dogs and cats and guinea pigs and loving animals. And when I saw the condition of the animals in the factory farm, and that it was a animal Auschwitz, it was a, mind blowing, unnecessary, continuous suffering. Um, I, I stopped eating meat that day. I started studying everything that I could about factory farming and animal rights work. And I was 9. And that put me into my first pretty like deep suicidal phase. Because like if someone was doing that to my dog, right? If my dog was in that kind of tortured position, like I would do anything to stop it. And this was billions of animals that were as sentient as my dog. And I didn't know how to stop it, but I couldn't know that that was happening and just ignore it and focus on other things and feel okay. I was like, I can stop thinking about them, but they can't get out of being there. They have no way to get themselves out. Maybe since I'm not in there, I can get them out. It could have been just as easy that I was born into that situation, this consciousness, or born into a child soldier in Darfur situation. I was born into this situation. That is a blessing that I can take no credit for, but there's an obligation that comes with it. And the obligation is maybe I can do something. And I realized that I couldn't kill myself because that didn't get any of the animals out. That didn't, save them. But I couldn't imagine, like, okay, how do I live and just be normal to people in conversations and talk about normal shit and be focused on whatever my own personal self-centered stuff is, or knowing that an infinity of torture is happening and be okay with it. Like I would have to dissociate completely. And that makes me a sociopath in a way. And so I felt like there was no way that I could just have a successful life that didn't require being a sociopath, but I couldn't kill myself. And so the only answer was I have to end factory farms. And so that got me engaged in activism. And then that showed me the overfishing of the oceans. And that showed me the destruction of the coral reefs. And that showed me the deforestation and the destruction of, all the things. And so it just kept expanding. And the benefit of that is when you really see the suffering in the world deeply enough and you take it in deeply enough that it can never not be with you, it's an antidote to the narcissism that is otherwise ubiquitously conditioned in everybody to just be focused on me, my desires, my goals, my problems. What do I need? How am I advancing myself, my progress? Which is just such a horrible prison of a way to be. And yet, in my house, that people spend 90% of their time indoors, separate from the natural world, separate from all the other beings around, filled with all the things that I wanted that continuously are re-engaging the what do I want, desire kind of egoic complex. We're being like those aspects of self are the ones that are being continuously developed in us, even by just where we are. And I find that when I've got to take people into deep wilderness who hadn't spent much time there, and particularly if I get to take a few people where they get to have a really authentic relationship with each other while they're there, with no game theory, no striving, no social status, anything, and they get to be in deep nature, I find that almost all of their addictive tendencies drop quickly. Like pretty quickly, they stop wanting to scroll their phone all the time. And most of the productive impulse also starts to drop. And that is an unhealthy version of the productive impulse. It's the one that is actually trying to fill an emptiness, trying to, be somebody. It's a whatever, be somebody, get something. But I also find that very quickly, everyone starts to, when I ask them, get much more at peace with death in that environment. Because when you're looking around in nature, there's no square foot that doesn't have death in it. There's decaying leaves, there's a dead tree, there's death everywhere, but there's life coming out of it, and it's all beautiful. And it's all interconnected, and there's no clear boundaries between the things, because the moss growing on the trees and the squirrels in it and the fungus on their roots and in that, and the living in the nuclear family home separate from everybody else and surrounded by the results of our own acquisition is conditioning a very different part of self. And so this is another interesting thing. I said that there's a lot of sociology that was conditioned, that was looking at the conditioned world and saying it's human nature. If most indigenous people are not afraid of death, so you look at Ernest Beck's kind of terror management theory, which is very useful in the kind of civilized world, civilized equal domesticated world. And because it's fair to think of the thing we call civilization as a domestication program for wild sapiens. Wild sapiens were, for hundreds of thousands of years, in relatively small tribes. Um, the idea that everything we do is to avoid fear of death. Well, you can induce fear of death in people, and then make a world system that induces more fear of death, and then where their desire to avoid the fear of death has them contribute to that world system. But that is, again, not innate to all forms of human nature. So I got to spend a lot of time in nature when I was a kid. And so just had a very deep love for the non-human world. And then a really deep feeling horrified at the destruction of it. And then yes, there were plenty of experiences in meditation and with what you could call psychedelics, and with, honestly, also just being alone in nature for long periods of time, where the intrinsic beauty of every being becomes forefront and became forefront in my awareness. The fact that every living thing is interconnected to every other thing, right? Like, who am I without plants? I couldn't exist without plants. They produce the oxygen that I need to live. They produce the calories, everything. So, and who would I be without bacteria? I wouldn't exist. Who would I be without viruses? I wouldn't exist. Who would I be without plankton? I wouldn't exist. So I am an emergent property of all these other life forms. But when I think of myself without thinking of them, I can actually advance my own interests while destroying the things that I actually depend upon, without which I don't even exist. I was talking to a friend the other day, a new colleague whose work I think is brilliant. Her name is Vanessa Andreotti. She wrote a book called Hospicing Modernity. You should have her on. And Indigenous woman. And she said that her chief's definition of colonialism, and I just thought this was so beautiful, was not taking other people's land, was not destruction of land or land ownership or ownership of people or any of those things. That those were all secondary epiphenomena. That the essence of colonialism was believing that there are separable things, and that all of that other stuff arises out of that, optimizing for some things at the expense of others, believing that they're separable. And that's grounded even in something deeper than belief, which is the being conditioned to perceive the world as a bunch of separate things, which happens even the way we teach kids language, to name things as nouns. There are no nouns, right? We call it a tree, it's a noun. It's a incredibly dynamic process of billions of biochemical interactions and biological interactions and physical interactions that give rise to that thing. It's a process, right? You're a process. All the things that you think of as nouns are just because you're not observing very well. And that you think of as separate things, does that tree stop at the mycorrhiza, or at the, like, it, if you say what is outside of it, it doesn't exist without that. All the way down to, like, is an atom a real thing? One atom of hydrogen. Well, what is the atom without the Higgs field? It doesn't exist. What is the atom without the electromagnetic field? What is the atom without the strong force? So the atom depends upon so much that is not the atom. And yet we ignore that when we define the atom as this. We take all the context for granted. So then everything that we care about, we pretend is a separable thing, and that we can advance it without understanding all the things it's connected to, and we harm the things it's connected to in the process. So both my study of ecology and my study of complexity and my study of the philosophy of science brought me to this. But yes, there were also and study of history, right? But also what you could call spiritual experiences that I think are just called, like, clear perception that is not totally distorted, in which the interconnectedness of everything with everything else and the uniqueness of everything are both apparent, right? That this tree in front of me is completely unique. There's not one exactly like it. This human, there's, like, you have experiences and perceptions and life experiences that nobody has ever had and nobody ever will have exactly like you do. And I could actually never know all of that fully. And so when you get that every being is totally unique, that means that they're priceless and irreplaceable. So you can't externalize harm anywhere. And all interconnected also means your fate and the fate of everything you care of is tied up with theirs. I think you can call it spiritual. I think it's scientifically true. I think it's philosophically true. I think it's just, and I think it is what naturally arises in perception if the mind is not too heavily distorted.
You reminded me of one of my favorite lessons from Ram Dass, where he talks about how there's two spiritual ideas that are in conflict with each other that we must hold in our heart at the same time. One is that suffering is endless and your heart has to break for all the suffering in the world. And at the same time, you have to see that it's all perfect. And those two are completely at odds with each other, but it's very important to be able to see things in both those lights at the same time. And so, like, oftentimes when people are on rough times, I lean towards the it's all perfect, because I'm trying to show them that this is all part of some higher wisdom that's training you for a greater purpose. And it seems like what you're focused on heavily is the endless suffering in the world. And part of me wants to, like, zoom out and say, hey, is this all part of some greater lesson? Like, are we kind of just killing ourselves? Like, all this um, mistreatment of the earth is really just going to destroy ourselves. Like that quote that you said earlier from the chief. He said, "We are not the strand. We are not the web. We are the strand in the web." And so, yeah, anything we do to destroy the earth, we're just doing to ourselves. Anytime you mistreat somebody, you're really just mistreating yourself. Hurt people, hurt others.
It is one of the really deep kind of paradoxes to contemplate, of the sense of order in the universe and the kind of perfection in that, and the sense of um, injustice and atrocity and what is worth changing. And I remember a time when I was maybe 25, and a woman asked me if I would talk with her daughter, who she had recently found out her husband had been raping for years. and her daughter was 15, and asked if I, would talk with her, see if I could help in any way. And the mom hadn't known. When she did know, she, threw the guy out and probably prosecuted and was trying to help the daughter. And in her desire to help, the mom had some kind of new age, you could call them, views of like everything happens for a reason. And she had been talking with her daughter in the sense of like everything happens for a reason, there's some good in this, etc. And the daughter came and sat with me. The mom left. Her arms were crossed, her body was turned away, she was just completely shut down. And early in the conversation, she said something like, if you're going to tell me that it's good that this happened, fuck off, basically. And I said, no, I'm not going to tell you that it's good that it happened. I'm going to tell you that it happened. And it's not your fault that it happened, but you have to deal with it. You have to make meaning of it and internalize it. And there's different ways you can do that. And you can have a very different life based on how you do that. And you can hate men forever, not trust people, feel disgust in your body. You can have those things. You can also go through a process that could give you the skills to help lots of other women process similar stuff. And so that you can process this in a way that leads to a more whole version of you that we could say is good doesn't mean I'm saying it was good that he did that. It's a difference. It's an important distinction to make in the everything is perfect side. The story, I would say any belief that any spiritual or kind of worldview belief that lessens your empathy, I'm not a big fan of. And so there's a lot of kind of spiritual philosophic bypass of suffering because we just don't want to deal with it. We don't want to feel it. Most of us are avoiding our own suffering, right? We're avoiding facing really certain very painful things that happened in our life when we were younger, certain aspects of our psyche that we really don't want to look at or feel. And so we don't want to be with anybody else's suffering because to really feel them, we would have to go into those states and we're avoiding it in ourselves. So we want to say everything is perfect or you get more of what you focus on. So focus on the positive or whatever it is. I think that the ability to transform trauma requires the ability to be with it fully, to feel it, acknowledge it, be with it, which requires no beliefs that are trying to bypass straight into it's just really a good thing. To be with your own experience and somebody else's experience. And so in general, I would say the spiritual views that make us more responsible to each other, that make us more aware of how that the only reason we're bothered by stuff, the unnecessary harm to things, is because we love them. Like, I wouldn't care that I wouldn't feel badly about the girl being raped if I didn't actually care about her existence. It's intrinsic to me being angry at him or heartbroken about that, or the reason that we care about the kids in Gaza or we care about the animals in the factory farm. The reason we're angry about it or destroyed or in trauma about it is because there's something intrinsic to the life of those things that we know is beautiful, that we know is meaningful, and that it is some kind of sin that is not acknowledging it and protecting it. Right? It is some kind of error in perception and behavior. And so in all the awareness of suffering, you can trace it in all the awareness of injustice in anybody, that we can say, man, there's a lot of really terrible, fucked up stuff in the world. I'm upset about it. if I trace back who I'm angry at that did it, or what I feel afraid of happening, or what I feel devastated about, if I trace it to the source of why I care, it's because those aspects of reality are intrinsically meaningful and beautiful to me, and I want to see them doing well, and I want to see them thriving. So I think it's important to feel all those feelings and then to trace them back to their source, because the source of all of it is love. And that's where the perfection part comes in. But then we also realize that insofar as we have some element of authentic choice and are not purely automata, we can make choices that are more and less in service of the whole. And where we have made and are making choices that are not that in service of the whole, that are not coming from perceiving clearly and adding clearly, it's important to see that and to own it, reconcile it.
Mm. How do we align this progress narrative with what's best for the whole? How do we align those two?
I would say that a meaning for something to be, for a change to be considered progress, the total set of effects that come from that change need to be considered. Not just the, like you make a technology and your goal is that the phone does this thing. Your goal isn't that child slave labor was used in the DRC to make the nickel or the cobalt for the battery. Your goal wasn't that all the mining tailing pollution went into the ocean. For it to really be considered progress, you have to factor all of that. And you have to factor the effects on all the beings. Are all the beings being affected through the total set of effects? Is this still progress? And I think if we consider the total consequences of our choices and we say, I want to change the world in ways that are actually comprehensively considerate of all the effects of those changes, that's what I would consider authentic progress. And if it is not considering that, it's change and it is advancement of some narrow thing, but it's advancement of a narrow thing that is not progress, but regress or worse for lots of other measures that matter and lots of other beings.
Is it possible to have a solution without unintended consequences?
It's possible to do orders of magnitude better than we do now. When the PFAS that is in every drop of water that we mentioned earlier, that has carcinogenic and other types of effects affecting all of biology, the chemical companies that invented it actually did animal trials that showed that it caused cancer. They hid those before it had ever went to market and ended up bringing it to market after hiding those effects. A similar thing happened with the lead additive in gasoline, where it was actually known that it was toxic. Studies were repressed. Propaganda about why it was safe was put forward. So often we say we couldn't have possibly known, and we actually did know, and we were lying. Other times, even like, when early days of Facebook, now social media gets to say, we didn't know it was going to polarize the whole population and increase teen suicide and body dysmorphia and all those things. Guys like Jared Lanier in 2008 were saying all that was going to happen, right? They were like openly leading technologists saying, look, if you monetize attention, you're going to create shorter attention spans, drive addiction, and take the things that capture people's attention the most, because they don't want to spend all their time on site. They want to get the fuck offline and do other things. So to keep their time on site because of your marketing model and keep them engaging, you're going to use more and more salacious, addictive kinds of things. And that's going to lead into tribalism and negative emotions being pushed and etc. And so there were people saying that at the time. They were ignored or said to fuck off. And then later we get to say plausible deniability. We couldn't have possibly known. It's impossible to anticipate unforeseen externalities. I remember one of the first times that I was kind of young doing work in environmental science, and a company asked me to do risk analysis. And so I came up with like all these things that would probably happen that were really bad if they did it. And they were like, no, no, we didn't want this. Like, we wanted you to do the thing that is industry standard risk analysis, where you check a bunch of boxes saying this isn't going to cause any harm so that we can say we did our due diligence and move forward with plausible deniability. And I'm like, So could we do a much better job of, we're inventing a new technology, and really think through, if this succeeds, what are the supply chains needed to create it? What is going to happen through the radical increase of all those supply chains? What are the behavioral changes of people using this, and what are the likely effects on psychologies and sociologies? If this becomes adaptive, what other things is it now outcompeting? Like blah blah blah. There's a way to think through it. we There's a term called red teaming that many people are familiar with. It comes from cybersecurity and from military games, which is, you're a bank and you're creating a cybersecurity structure. You take some of your cybersecurity guys to be hackers and try to break into it, right? They're red teaming. They're trying to break the thing that you're trying to build to see if there are vulnerabilities. Or you take one branch of, your own military and have them try to do a attack against your defense systems. So we came up with this nonprofit organization I work with. We came up with a related process called yellow teaming, which is not, the red teaming is saying how might your project fail. Yellow teaming is, if it succeeds, what else might it externalize harm to? Do the yellow teaming up front, and then see where there are harm externalities, how you can change the design to internalize those, and make sure that, and this comes that question that you said, Jeff Goldblum asked, should we do it? There's a way to go about inquiring into the should we do it. And for some things you'll say no. For other things you'll say, well, we could change the design in these ways, right? So obviously, if social media had not had an advertisement model for its revenue model that monetized people's attention, where it made more money as they spent more time on site and as they clicked on, engaged in more things, they would have, that same underlying technology of curating all the world's information, harvesting data about people and curating the world's information to them. If, say, you had paid for the service and you could set the settings of how you wanted your mind to be affected, you could say, actually, I want to be exposed to ideas that are very different than the ideas I currently have. I want not things that appeal to limbic hijacks. I want things that have longer, deeper analyses rather than short attention span types of things. And so you could develop those technologies in very different ways if you thought through what the externalities might be and then said, how do we do the design differently? There's all this conversation about, should we censor hate speech on social media? And it's mostly a misnomer, because it's not that someone says some nasty thing that's a problem. It's that that thing gets amplified to millions of people in a way that in a town square would have never happened. What is the algorithm that determines if 5 people see your thing or 500 million people see your thing? The algorithm actually selects for the things that cause the most division, right? Because if you get people fighting in a thread, the activity of that thread upregulates the thing. So that algorithm is going to polarize the population. It's going to create more enmity. Now, could you design the algorithm to say, we're not going to maximize for engagement, in which case fighting can be engagement. Because we're not talking about freedom of speech now. We're talking about an unprecedented thing in the history of the world, which is the ability to have someone's idea put in front of the whole world. And we're the ones, the algorithm is getting to choose how much attention this thing gets. It's not like there's some natural selection where if people really like it, it's the algorithm is picking certain things that it's optimizing, how many people's newsfeed it puts it in and in what position of primacy. So it's like, that has nothing to do with freedom of speech. That's a totally different, weird thing. And so if you say, well, we can amplify anybody's ideas, what is the basis of the should, the ought associated with the is, of which ideas are really worth amplifying? Right now, it's mostly the worst ones, the ones that are intrinsically most divisive and limbic hijacking and attention capturing. And so what if you said, okay, we're going to look at ideas that, or content that gets generally positive reaction across political lines. and across ideological divides, meaning you're finding things that are more shared views than divisive views. And that those people can still post the divisive ones, but the ones the algorithm is going to upregulate are those ones. You'd have a very different world. You'd have a world in which people started to recognize more and more things that they share in common that they could then build on and continue to increase, rather than like the weirdest straw man versions of each other that isn't, even true. And you'd have an incentive for content creators to write things that were actually going to appeal across ideologic divides, rather than appeal to one while polarizing the other, which actually drives the arms race of both sides. So if you do that, kind of anticipate the harms that might occur, you might just not do the thing, but you might also do the thing very differently, right? You might also change the design in very fundamental ways. So if we optimize for very narrow goals, don't pay attention to all the other effects, but continue to have exponentially more powerful technologies that scale to the world faster and have effects in the world much faster, the cumulative externalities of that, plus the cumulative rivalry that drives, will be extinctionary. And this kind of comes like from a mythopoetic perspective. It's something like the total amount of technological power that humanity stewards is not like any other animal, right? Even stone tools were not like any other animal. But the ability to make new species through genetic modification is really, really different. The ability to split the nucleus of atoms and make, nuclear explosions and nuclear winter, the ability to like clear cut whole ecosystems and make cities the size of Tokyo, and artificial intelligence that can beat all humans combined at defined types of tasks. This is much more like the power of gods of antiquity, but without the wisdom of it. And that self destructs. So we have developed the kind of mind that analyzes parts well, that analyzes a very tiny domain of is called the objective parts interaction, that we can define kind of causal relationships with, that we can apply to technology. They get selected for if it grows profits, wins in war, can convince more people to believe a particular thing. And we have not correspondingly grown the wisdom of what types of tech should be built. And basically what I'm saying is we either have to do that, or this process doesn't continue very long.
That's really well said. My concern is, how is this going to be regulated? Like, you're going to need a third party to decide, hey, this second order effect is going to cause a lot of harm. You can't do that. It instantly makes me think, let's say I'm trying to upload a YouTube video and somebody says, hey, this is going to lead a lot of viewers to go check out some conspiracy theories that might lead them to oppose the government. You can't post this video. So I've been butting heads quite a bit with these like policymakers of the algorithm, the regulators, because
Yep.
as a content creator, I'm always fighting them over what I can and can't post. I'm always getting things
Right.
taken down or shadow banned, and that's very frustrating. So it's a very hard thing to regulate.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
So there are twin failure modes that the world faces right now. And throughout history, there's always been failure modes that come from whatever the system of social coordination is, government, institutions, market, religion, whatever the systems of social coordination are not effective, and you get increasing chaos, right? Under critical things aren't manufactured or made that need to be, that people are warring with each other. There's, things like that. Or the failure mode on the other side is that the social coordination system has enough power to check those things, and it itself becomes corrupt, and you get tyranny. And so there's this kind of chaos on one side and tyranny on the other, twin failure modes, and we don't want either of those. And in the same way that we said, we're, for the first time in history, even though empires have always fallen, we're at the place where the thing that you could consider the unit of civilization is really the entire planet. It's these 6 continent supply chains that make the stuff that all of the civilizations depend upon, and the following globalization, we are at a place where for the first time you could have chaos, global catastrophic risk for the whole planet. We're also, though, at the place where you could have autocratic dystopia for the whole planet. Right? Before industrial tech, you could not destroy the ecosystem. Like, you just couldn't fish out all the fish with fishing rods. And but when you have mile-long drift nets where you can pull up whole schools of fish all day long, yeah, you can overfish the whole ocean, right? But it's the scale of the tech. Before nuclear weapons, we couldn't destroy everything quickly, even if we wanted to. There were people who really tried. And so the scope of the catastrophic potential is related to our technological capacity. But the same technology can also make control dystopias, right? So, and this is, you can see the intuitions of people focus on one of these problems or the other. There are people who are just terrified of all regulation and typically tend to think that it's almost always corrupt and whatever. And there are other people who are terrified of what, especially exponentiating tech and market forces do to the world without anything checking them. And those are both right. They're both right. And so there is a place where, to think about this correctly, you have to embrace the rock and the hard place and not just focus on one and not the other, because the solution to one ends up being the other one. So we can see that multipolar traps between major nations lead to probably destruction of everything, right? The nations in multipolar traps with each other are all extracting more fossil fuels every year, are all externalizing all their pollution costs, because nobody wants to internalize the pollution costs themselves if everyone else doesn't, and then have less margins to compete. Everybody is putting more energy into militaries, etc. So you're like, okay, the competitive nature between the countries will destroy everything. So then, of course, one proposed solution is we need a one world government so we don't have that situation. And yet, of course, we can see that where power has become very concentrated, it has become corrupt in proportion to its concentration everywhere. And so the idea of a one world government, obviously, that in the time of the Roman Empire or whatever, you couldn't really see what everybody was doing. You couldn't enforce rule of law because of the technological limitations. But in an age where we have real-time imaging of every spot on the surface of the Earth every day through satellites, and increasingly all of the sensor data, all of the satellite data, it can all be fed to AIs big enough to process all of that, you could have a terrifying global dystopic control state. And if that, and when we talk about checks and balances on power, if, let's say, we recognize how destructive decentralized artificial intelligence, the way it is developing right now, could be, because can you use it to make better chemical weapons, to make better bioweapons, to figure out better infrastructure attacks, to make better fake news, to make better propaganda? Yeah, you can use it for all those things. And even the things that you say are good things are good in the definition, in the market that does the narrow success thing. So you just speed up the narrow success and the total externalities. So we'd say, no, the AI is going to save the environment because it's going to give us all these efficiencies. We have continued to make more efficient tech every year while using more energy every year. Because efficiency doesn't mean you use less. It means the cost of the industrial input goes down, so new market sectors open up that weren't profitable before. That's called the Jevons paradox. And it's one of the really critical things to understand here, is that if in all kind of environmental type dynamics, is when the cost of energy goes down, we use more energy, not less. When the cost of compute goes down, we use more compute, not less. When the cost of material acquisition goes down, you use more, not less. Because of certain, like, let's say the cost of energy goes down. Now there's this whole area that I can mine that I couldn't afford to mine before because the cost to extract it wasn't enough for the market value. But now that my energy costs are lower, now I can mine a lot more areas and put more mining pollution and industrial tailings into the water. So in the market type dynamics that we have now, where almost every goal happens at the expense of lots of externalities, even the quote unquote good things that you use AI to optimize end up driving the rate of the externalities faster, let alone all of the weaponized kinds of applications. So, okay, so let's say we're like, man, that's really bad, and everybody's racing to do it, and we're doing the exact opposite of like thoughtful forecasting and testing and seeing what the safe thing would be. We're doing the here's ChatGPT, let's roll it out to hundreds of millions of people instantly. Let's get governments to start using it. Let's get companies based on it, where then once you find out how bad it is, you can't roll it back because the entire economy depends upon it. The speed of deployment scale of AI right now compared to, say, of oil, when U.S. Standard Oil was developing, is so mind-blowingly fast. Like the speed to 100 million users in a week with threads or something like that. And that's the exact opposite of how you make sure that you are not causing a lot of harm. Is you do a lot of protracted thinking, and then when you implement it, you do a lot of observation of the implementation at a smaller scale. So you have a safe to fail probe, and then you make changes on it because of the things you couldn't have anticipated without doing some experiments, not rapid speed to scale. Okay, so you say, well, what if right now we're not succeeding on regulating it in any good way? It is proceeding, and the applications of it are really terrifying. But let's say we could, and we said, all right, we're going to stop all of the kind of market application of that thing until we have, and the burden of proof has to be on proving that it's adequately safe, not that it can destroy stuff like lead and DDT, and then later, after it does all the destruction, then we regulate it. At this level of power, by the time we realize the destruction that it's caused, it will be too late and irreversible. Okay, well, if we did regulate it and say we're not going to allow that, who is the we, right? That would actually, because there's so much market investment, that would take government intervention using monopoly of violence, rule of law, backed by monopoly of violence to shut it down. Do you know that military contractors in classified projects are not still developing the same things? Like, does that get shut down in the same regulation? Pretty hard to know that. And if it's not, then you're still developing that tech just with no checks and balances, right? Such that the monopoly of power now is nearly an infinite monopoly of power. This is the hardest issue humanity is facing right now, is that the market forces, without very strong regulation, will drive us past planetary boundaries and lots of other global catastrophic risks. Incentives alone are not enough to fix it. It needs deterrence. And yet the regulatory systems don't have the visibility, the integrity, the checks and balances they need to be trusted with the power needed to regulate all of that. So we both have to basically restructure governance such that the transparency, accountability, et cetera, necessary to regulate things is there, with actually the wisdom at the basis is there, and have it do that very quickly. And obviously the chances of that don't sound good. It doesn't fundamentally require violating any laws of physics to do it. It's just a hard thing to accomplish. But it's important to hold that the control dystopia and the decentralized catastrophe, that the solutions to one usually make the other one worse. And the actual solutions we're interested in are neither. And this is where we need to actually deepen our understanding of the failure modes, hold them together, and hold designing away from both as the design constraints.
Yeah, because right now with AI, it's advancing so fast. It seems like each week there's some new giant update. When you look at AI from a year ago, it's a joke compared to what crazy deepfake things they're coming out with today. And they're talking about regulating it, but it seems like it's just advancing so fast. By the time they try to figure out some regulating laws, it's going to be like 20,000 years more advanced. And
Correct.
yeah.
The tech is evolving at the intersection of multiple exponential curves. And I mean formally exponential. So, we started to understand exponential curves in tech with like Moore's law, where you would get this progressive doubling of compute speed, per cost every couple of years. Right now, just in the hardware in the AI space, right, the GPU cluster hardware, it is 10xing in 6 months, and the rate of that is increasing. So you have an exponential curve in hardware. You have an exponential curve in the amount of data available. You have an exponential curve in the amount of capital being invested and people working in the space, an exponential curve in the software development of the cognitive architectures involved, and all of those are intersecting. And law is not only still working as slowly as it did in the founding of this country, it's working slower because of increasing polarization of the population that has elected increasingly polarized representatives that disagree on everything. And so the nature of and that's important to say, the social media is actually an early AI, right? It's using an early form of AI to be able to curate all of the world's content to maximize its stickiness for you and behavioral dynamics for you based on harvesting behavioral data about you. So deepfakes now are creating content. That first one was curating content. The curating content is very powerful because that creates the incentive for every other content producer in the world to produce stuff that the algorithms want, including mainstream news and everything else that increasingly is successful only insofar as it's successful there. So that technology has simultaneously decreased the capacity of government to govern, has decreased the clarity of thinking and collective intelligence of the population, increased their enmity, and increased their certainty and wrongness at the same time, which is a terrible combination, right? Increasing certainty with decreasing scope of understanding on both sides or all sides of most issues, while increasing the rate of the tech development itself and increasing the amount of capital allocated to it. So obviously that regulatory system is dead. And the regulatory system has to be able to move at a speed of the technology that is being developed, or it has no chance at all. That requires some very fundamental innovations in how we think of governance. And of course, if the founding fathers were alive today and not doing the thing in 1776, and they were looking at the tech stack today and the issues now, they would not have come up with the exact same thing. Even those people, right? They would have come up with a different set of things, because obviously. So the amount of innovation in tech does require innovation in social technology. How do we coordinate that well? And innovation in social technology, not just that can move faster and be more powerful, like deregulation of the markets and venture capital and stuff, but innovation in social technology that is actually aligned with a viable future.
What do you think it'll mean to be a human when AI can do everything better and faster? What's going to be humans' roles in this post AI world that's coming?
On the primary current approaches to AI, I don't think it will be able to do everything faster and better than humans, but it will do lots of things, right? If you look at LLMs right now and you talk to them, you'll notice that. So your listeners have probably heard the talk of that they hallucinate. Hallucinate's not really the right term. They confabulate. They'll make shit up that sounds right, but that isn't true, because they don't actually understand, right? They're not actually understanding concepts in any meaningful way. They're looking at statistical relationships between the likelihood of the next word seeming reasonable to the sentence, factoring all of human language. And so they'll make sentences that sound good, and if you don't know anything, sound reasonable. Sometimes they're quoting stats that are completely fabricated, and made up. Sometimes the understanding is extremely distorted. You'll also notice that recombining concepts that exist happens a lot more than anything like novelty of insight. So the kind of cognitive architectures that are being used are different in kind than the types of cognitive architectures happening inside of humans. Now, there are obviously people who are studying how it happens in humans trying to replicate that. So it might go in different directions. The direction in which it's currently going, and not just LLMs, but AIs in general, is mostly optimized for near term maximum market applications. So we're getting very good at using them for weapons targeting, for um, things like, some good things like energy grid distribution type things and solving traveling salesman problems for supply chains and stuff. Um, but also stuff like making believable-ish content at a unbelievable scale and speed that will become most of all content online very soon. That is has no actual connection to reality. The thing that is generating it has no actual understanding of reality. So that's pretty bad. I do. So let's, but I understand what you're asking, which is if we've already had a bunch of jobs be automated in the past, there have been the creation of new jobs. Um, Nobody's all that upset that elevators got automated and that there isn't, someone having to be the elevator man, because there were new jobs that were created in the process of that automation. And just to get a sense, like the internal combustion engine tractor has made it to where there are 1/50th as many people involved in food production as there were before. So that's a pretty humongous automation of human activity. With AI, some people are like, it'll automate a lot of jobs, but it'll also make a lot of new jobs, and so there won't be a job issue. This is fundamentally not true about AI in the same way that it's true about other things, because like the other technologies came from the type of human intelligence that can figure out how to make a new thing, right? The internal combustion and the automated elevator came from human intelligence doing a certain thing. AI is actually trying to make the technology of that type of human intelligence at exponentially more scale that will identify, yes, it'll create new market niches, but then it will simultaneously figure out how to automate them. That's very different. Obviously, there's a lot of versions of that world that look pretty dystopic. And if you advance that world and you keep capitalism as the underlying system, then at least in the past, where there was a need for labor, you had a serf class that had some utility to the elites, as opposed to no utility at all. This is also, though, why some people running AI companies are fans of some kind of universal basic income, is because if they're competing for who wins Master of the Galaxy, who will actually own everything and all of the creative capacity and means of production, whatever, having the people not rebel is worth some small amount, while they increasingly get their needs met in a digital universe that costs us almost nothing, less in a physical universe, while they are mostly obsolete. And then that gets packaged as a nicer idea of like, oh, we'll have this time to pursue creative endeavors and stuff. So, the good part of the question, the good part of the AI question is a thought experiment. Is if you could automate all of the tasks that humans do, or at least most of the tasks that humans do, what is a meaningful human life? And what is unique to what it means to be human that is not simply task fulfillment? That's actually a really good question. And it grounds in experience, right? We're not building AIs that can appreciate sunsets. We are building AIs that can say words that sound like empathy but are not empathy. What is amongst other things, one thing that is unique to being a sentient thing as opposed to just an intelligent thing is the capacity for experience and the capacity for shared experience. And it's definitely true that in the future that I hope for, a much higher percentage of everyone's time will be allocated to things that are in the domain of interpersonal care. So, if we could automate a lot of things that humans do, and or also make a world system where so much of the stuff that we do that is totally unnecessary and basically just kind of a racket, we have this is another actual important point. I'll take a tangent. The multipolar trap, in the same way we said some people will start a company and know that the thing is going to be harmful, lie about it, and then when it's found out that it's harmful, say it's impossible to anticipate unforeseen things we couldn't have possibly known, right? So the fact that it's hard to anticipate unforeseen things is kind of a source of plausible deniability. Or in a more generous case, they don't know, but they don't try really hard to know. They don't spend a lot of research dollars looking at why we shouldn't do this thing. Because there's the guy who does that doesn't win first mover advantage and spend all of it on optimizing how to do the thing fastest, which is why law has increasingly made corporate personhoods under laws that were made for slavery so that the directors were protected, so the people actually making the choices can't get prosecuted for the activity of the company and blah, blah, blah. So in the same way that saying, well, we couldn't anticipate externalities is usually a lie, oftentimes the multipolar trap is a lie. We have to, because they are. The groups that say that the most are the actual most powerful ones that could create agreements to change it, but also are the ones that believe they can win. The people that don't believe they can win are way more likely to make an agreement to say, let's all not do this thing. The ones that are like, no, I think I can win, they'll say we couldn't possibly stop the AI race with, because China's going to get there first, whatever. So we have to be this race. We're saying it like, if the US really wanted to stop the AI arms race, really, really authentically wanted that because they saw the risk of it, saw that was no good for anyone, could they do the geopolitical work to get China to cooperate and then the two of them lead the rest of the world in the cooperation? Yes, I believe so. But the guy that thinks it can win doesn't want to do that. And the people that came to power in the rivalrous context of win, not cooperate, are better at that mode of mind than the other mode of mind. So it's also important to understand that the most powerful players within a multipolar trap actually have the power to bind it or change it. But they're usually the ones driving it. In which case, the argument of the multipolar trap is largely the justification for their own attempt to win.
That's a great point about how, yeah, if you're not in a position to win, of course you're going to make a deal. That makes perfect sense. So I guess that's very telling. If somebody's not willing to make a deal, they're kind of indirectly revealing their intentions.
Often. And they'll say, we're willing, they're not willing, so we're forced into this, while hiding all of the things that the other side isn't willing because of the way we defected on all of our deals with them historically or things like that.
Well, we've gone on for a good amount of time, but there's still some questions I'd really like to ask you. If you have to leave, let me know. But something I've been really interested in is it seems like our institutions are falling apart right now. Or we've got Hollywood's falling apart, our academic institutions, the mainstream media, government. It seems like a lot of these institutions are crumbling. And I'm wondering, is this all related? Is there one common thing that's causing all these to fall apart? Or are we just losing faith in our institutions? Do we need our institutions? Is there a way to save them? I think I've been the most interested in the academic focus of this, just seeing the downfall of colleges and people saying it's not for me anymore, and a lot of young people checking out. I think it's good that I think we need colleges, but I think that they're misaligned with what society actually needs.
You want me to talk about colleges or institutions in general?
Um, I guess we could probably start with colleges.
Let me start by talking about democracy. I think that's a relevant frame because the higher order institutions contextualize or other ones. Uh, you had asked me in the email, is democracy ending? Um, so this is basically the concept of the institution of nation states being able to be something like liberal democracies as opposed to autocracies or something else. Um, in one way, there is a really important critique that democracies have never really existed. That the founding of the US had all of the shitty jobs done by slaves who had no say in the fact that they did all the shitty jobs. Obviously, women didn't have a say at the time. Um, and that if people had to democratically vote for the totality of what happened, but where the people who were voting were also responsible for all of the labor, that whole system wouldn't have worked. Where if they had to actually pay fair labor that people would have voted for that wasn't exploitive, it wouldn't have had the margins to grow the way that it did, things like that. Um, and you see that after the Civil War was fought, we didn't end slavery because the peonage system just kind of extended the slavery, right? The 13th Amendment said, not shall not be slaves except as a punishment for a crime. So a bunch of fake crimes were made up to be able to put black people in prison and put them on basically forced labor again. When that ended, it was largely associated with globalization and the ability to ship the slavery to the third world. So there are more people in indentured servitude or conditions of slavery today than there have been at any point in the history of the world. And we ship most of the cheap labor and really environmentally harming things, whatever, to those areas that are a part of the margins of how things work. So calling that democracy is kind of weird. Obviously, inside of the corporations, those are not democracies. Those are basically autocracies, right? Which do a huge amount of everything. And the military is not a democracy, and et cetera. So there's only a little bit that was supposedly democracy, and it's really hard to say that it was that thing. But even insofar as it was, that thing has eroded in some very significant ways that require a restructuring of the entire idea set. Specifically, that was able to happen here in the way that it was. And each of the modern democracies have different but related stories because it was basically the whole continent separated from any kind of adversaries with oceans. And that was a huge part of why certain things were possible. And that you could share with the population things that you wouldn't want to share with enemies, and it wouldn't instantly get to the enemies, such that the people could be apprised of key decisions to make. But as technology advanced and telecommunications emerged and very good ability to spy emerged, and the ability to actuate in other places through missiles and things much faster than ships going across the ocean emerged, sharing information with the citizens equaled sharing it with the Soviets, right? And sharing it with any kind of adversary. And so all the things that were of importance to national security couldn't be shared. And increasingly, everything started to become an issue of national security because issues about our water supply and key issues about our food supply and key issues about what the Fed is going to do with finances and et cetera, all start to be increasingly national security things, becoming increasingly classified. And how do you do democracy if most of the most important decisions no one's even allowed to know any of the information about? And yet, in a situation of adversaries being able to listen from across the world and also being able to actuate from across the world, how do you share all of the information that is sensitive to the population? This is an issue that democracy faces today that it did not face in 1776. And let's take that one a little bit further. When Popper wrote about open society, and that kind of the idea of democracy also went along with the idea of the open publishing of science. Everybody could know what was happening in science and academia, and because everybody could be comprehensively educated, right? The antecedents for democracy in all the founding documents was the comprehensive education of everyone and the comprehensive informedness of everyone. So everybody had to have public education. Everybody had to have a kind of free and independent news media, fourth estate, such that the population could both had the education to make sense of things and the information to make sense of things, such that they could make good informed decisions. We can see that the level of education that the American population has relative to the complexity of the issues it faces. So, what understanding of the history of the Israel Palestine conflict or Ukraine Russia dynamics or all the geopolitics involved or the risks associated with CRISPR or artificial intelligence or the actual condition of um, dead zones and oceans, like how much of the dynamics regarding that good regulation would need, does the public understand anything about? Obviously, the complexity of the information space has increased exponentially, and the educational quality has in many ways went down simultaneously. And the news has been, increasingly, partisanized, blah blah blah. So the antecedents for democracy are not in place. Do you have a population that is educated enough, well informed enough in ways that are not just the propaganda of vested interests to be able to make good choices adequate to the complexity of the choices we need to make in the timescales? Like, obviously not even close. Um, so there is a study, I think it was done by Braver Angels, or at least popularized by them, that showed that since the 1970s, popular opinion has 0% correlation with legislation. What the people want has absolutely no effect on legislation.
That's crazy.
The amount of marketing, I mean, the amount of lobbying dollars has perfect correlation. And so now again, we come back to the topic you were asking about, captured government. So the kind of core idea of this liberal democracy thing was that the market would naturally get power law distributions. If you just had a pure market, you end up getting a situation where some people are better at making money than others. That money is power for everything, because that money is like a unit of game theory, right? It's like a token that allows you to buy private mercenaries, it allows you to buy marketing, it allows you to buy labor, tech, whatever. So I need to change the views of people, I need to get politicians on my side, I need to build some new technology, I need to buy land. Money is something that has no intrinsic value, but optionality for every type of value. And so everyone started valuing money more than anything else because it represented the optionality for everything else, which is obviously game theoretically relevant. And so some people would be better at making money than others. Those who have more money have more ability to make more money, even just through compounding interest. Compounding interest grows faster than the general market does. This is what Piketty showed in Capital in the 21st Century, that in the rich will get richer, poor will get poorer, intrinsic to the system, even if it wasn't for the fact also that the rich get better education and better healthcare and better access to financial services and all those types of things. So you'll naturally get a power law distribution where if the wealth inequality increases over time until it's so imbalanced that if you just had a market like that and you didn't have a kind of state, then pretty much everybody has no voice. Only the amount of voice you have to determine the world is proportional to the amount of money you have. And that ends up really sucking for a lot of things, right? And there's a lot of things where there's market incentive to do the thing that we still don't want to do. We don't want to cut down all the national parks. We don't want all of the markets on organs and stuff like that. So we decide, no, we're going to have a state, but we want a minimal state. The job of the state is to serve the collective will of the people, including the people who don't have a lot of money. And the state has to be powerful enough to check the powerful forces in the market, such that where the powerful forces in the market have a vested interest to do something that is actually bad for the whole, and the whole all agrees we don't want that, you're able to check it. That's really the purpose of the state, is to check excesses of the market aligned with the will of the people, assuming that there is both a moral and scientific education of all of the people and comprehensive informedness of them such that the will of the people would be a good idea. Now, so it's supposed to be that the state is checking the market, but the people are checking the state. It's supposed to be a government of, for, and by the people, where there's high transparency. The people are not career politicians; they're elected from the people. Those kinds of things. And obviously, we do not have a situation where the government is of, for, and by the people, and the people are effectively checking the state. As a result, the state is no longer effectively checking the market. The market ends up capturing the state. So if the market is going to be regulated by the state in a way that decreases its profits, then its own responsibility to grow as a business is to do lobbying to change the legislation in favor of its interests. Now, the private sector can pay for a bunch of lawyers to write a bunch of law in a way that the general people can't. And so we have a world today where the vast majority of all new law is written by the private sector in its own interests. You have a situation of the revolving doors where someone from industry moves into the position of being the regulator who's regulating in the interest of the companies they were just employed by and will be employed by again after their term is over, right? That revolving door. So if your FDA commissioner had worked in big pharma or big ag and then goes to work there afterwards, like what's the chance that that's good regulation? And you will also have things like public-private partnerships, which are key to how AI is being regulated right now, which is, okay, because the government is too slow and you guys don't really know where the current tech is at, and because you don't have the money and the budget for it, we, the market sector who are advancing the tech and know where it's really at and have the expertise and we can afford to do it, we understand that this needs regulated. There's some risks here. So we're going to create a partnership between the government side and the private side. Well, who ends up writing the operating agreement? Always the private side that ends up being able to pay for the lawyers. And who in which interest? In the interest of regulating their own activity so heavily that it affects their market capabilities? Obviously not. So almost everywhere that you see revolving doors, that you see lobbying, that you see public-private partnerships, you see basically a state that is doing the bidding of the market. And specifically what that means is the interest of some in the market, not in the interest of everybody and not in the interest of the commons. So is that democracy? No, right? So and when your only choices for who is an elected representative are people that nobody likes on either side, and that nobody really got to have any good say up front in who might be involved in that process. They just kind of came out of nowhere, picked by parties and stuff. And where at best you get to vote yes or no on a proposition, but the proposition sucks both ways. And you weren't involved in any participatory process of crafting what would be a good proposition in the first place. So we have a kabuki theater of democracy. We don't have democracy, right? But we also couldn't have democracy in the 1776 style with these issues. So given that we have innovated our tech to the place that we still have adversarial relationships with other places in the world, but they can be spying on us with satellites in real time and use the information the public has and infiltrate the public through, U.S. intelligence and law enforcement identified that the 16 top most popular evangelical Facebook groups were all run by Russian troll farms. And so the Russian troll farm is curating the stuff in those groups that turns the people against other people and against the state. So how do you deal with a powerful opponent? Turn them against themselves. A lot of people thought, oh, Russia likes Trump and China likes Biden. No, Russia and China both like a U.S. that is more divided with itself. And the same way that we are with them, right? Like the try to sow division is a thing, is a strategy. What we want with a democracy is that the choices that affect everyone's life, everyone gets to participate in the making of those choices as much as possible. That people's lives are not subject to things that they have no say in. And insofar as we can also really well educate everybody and Obviously, even when I say we can, that's a very tricky thing. Who is the we and what are they calling good education is a very tricky thing. Insofar as it is possible to have a competent and shared understanding of the world emerge and effective ability to communicate across different worldviews towards things that don't just turn into war, then democracy is increasingly viable only in that cultural antecedent. And the mechanisms by which that could be mediated moving forward have to be completely different than they have been before because the context is completely different.
That was brilliantly explained. Thank you for that. And I've heard an idea. I don't know if you've heard this, but the smaller the group of people, the more trust there is. And so the more open you can have a society. So, like with your family, you want to be a socialist and just share everything. With your community, you can be a communist. With your region, you can be a Democrat. But with the bigger you get, the less trust there is. So, of course, people are going to be more skeptical. And that's kind of one of the defining features of conservatives is they're very paranoid and skeptical of the government. I tend
Yeah,
to,
and
yeah.
it is in the interest of the it's hard to even define what this is. It is in the interest of the political class to have people's skepticism stay partisan. So, as long as the Republicans say that the um, liberals are the ones who want big government and are ruining everything and ruining education and et cetera, and but their whole answer is to not really engage in deep democratic process where they're involved in making sense of the world and crafting what good propositions would be and evolving the systems of government. It's to get the guy that is saying that the liberals are bad, who's their guy, elected to still run the system with almost none of their authentic understanding or input. And the liberals doing the exact same thing, then you get to take everybody's recognition that the system isn't working and keep perpetuating the system and have them all work very hard to continue to do something that is obviously just perpetuating the system. Gregory Bateson coined this term schismogenesis, which is where the schism is actually the generator of the ongoing growth in the system. And so you have a movement, say, and it appeals to some people and it anti appeals to other people. And it's not that all movements must do that, but it's that movements that are crafted in a way that, let's say we have values that are in a dialectical relationship and you have to consider them together, like rights and responsibilities or whatever. And one emphasizes one, you have a movement that emphasizes one of these. And some people who are really paying attention to that thing will really care. And other people who recognize there's something really imbalanced about it care over here. So you can have a movement where the success of that movement actually really scares other people. In the same way that you said earlier, as one nation increases its relative security, it decreases the security of everybody else. So now everybody else has to increase their process. Now that just means arms races forever is the only possible answer. Increasing the total killing power of the world the entire time while increasing the enmity, of everybody. So it's like, this is not a good end game. So similarly, you have a movement that says some true things, but leaves out some really important things. And as a result, it appeals to some people, not other people, or it emphasizes certain values, not other ones. And so that movement's success drives its counter movement. And so it never actually wins. It's so focused on a near term win. But if it innovates any method of being more successful, now we're going to use social media in elections, or now we're going to whatever it is, the other side instantly reverse engineers it, innovates, does the same kinds of things. And intrinsic to how one side is appealing to their support base, they are anti appealing to the other side. They're actually driving the counter reaction on the other side. So any attempt to change the world that is schismogenic will not create a good world. And if you want to create a good world, you want to think about, how does this look from everybody's perspective? And what is a more complete understanding of the world that integrates all those perspectives? And how could we move that thing forward? That's very different.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of these politicians and the arguments, that we hear are just distractions for what, the power that's really going on in the background. So I'm really thankful that you've taken this time to answer these questions. And every time we talk, I have to think and reflect for quite a long time because I have some cognitive biases and things, and you are really good at addressing those and just making me think of like my blind spots. And there's certain things that you've said that have made me think and really just back off on certain things that I feel strongly about and really
Yeah.
reevaluate them. And I don't think I've ever talked to anybody that has had that much of an effect on my thinking just from conversations, you know? So thank you.
You said something really important that I think is a good closing point. People should be really dubious of their own certainty. Um, it's it's sad how much this is true, but the amount that people really actually think is amazingly low. And so, in general, if you give me 4 or 5 of someone's political views, what they think on gun control, what they think on abortion, what they think on climate change, what they think on COVID, whatever, and I can predict the rest of their views with high accuracy, it's hard to say that they're thinking. They are in a mimetic complex that is, the moment you identify the mimetic complex, you know the vast majority of everything that they think. And so, similarly, if you're in a conversation with someone and pretty soon you know what their responses to most things are going to be, and they're actually more predictable than ChatGPT is. They don't even pass the Turing test, right? Like, most people don't even pass the Turing test when you're talking to them of like, are they saying anything that indicates that there is some real depth of consideration and sentience and whatever on the other side? Um, and so I think David Bohm said that most people are engaged in thoughting, that thoughts arise and new ideas come in. They hit the person's existing cognitive biases and mimetic filters. Those filters either reject or accept the thought. If they accept it, they seek to propagate it by trying to sell other people on the idea. And that pretty much they're a mostly unconscious meme filtering and propagation system. This is really sad and also unnecessary. And so you can correct this, but you have to care about what is real more than any of your ideas about what is real. And any place where your identity is associated with an idea, I'm a pro science person, or I'm an anti vax person, or I'm a Zionist, or I'm an anti Zionist, or I'm a conservative, your identity will probably have to die when you recognize that those ideas are very limited and that there are ideas on the other side that are also good. And so, similarly, if there are ideas that you hold on to because they support your vested interests, like the way that you make money and get the way that you got your fame and the whatever it is a good thing. So there is a depth of earnestness to be like, no, no, I actually want to understand the reality I exist in. I was born. I don't know why. I'm here for a very short period of time and then I'll be dead. There's this amazing reality I didn't make. I want to understand it. I want to understand how it works. I want to understand what's meaningful about it so that I can live in the most authentic and meaningful way possible. Then, if that's the case, then what you are more curious about than anything is your own blind spots and your own biases. And you want to investigate them profoundly. You don't want to ever double down on them. So if you have you make a list, what are all the things that I believe fervently? Then find who are the smartest people that disagree and really listen. Because there might be people who have studied this way more than you, know way more stuff, and they disagree for some important reasons. And maybe they're not 100% right either, right? In fact, finding where experts disagree in a field is one of the best ways to enter the field. Because if they've studied the field for decades with deep earnestness, more than your, cursory understanding, and they disagree, it means that maybe none of the worldviews or epistemologies are adequate. And you want to say, can I understand why each of them think what they do? Can I understand where the difference is? And maybe because I'm not as invested, is there a chance I might be more plastic and I could see, is there a view in which there are partial truths in what each of them are saying? And so to just look at, where do I hold fervently to something, and who are the smartest people that disagree, and really try to take it in, that will do so much to improve the quality of your thinking, your understanding of the world, and also just the quality of you as a human being, who will lead with more respect with other people, that will have more authentic humility. One of the other things, like when you start to learn about a topic, there's this Dunning-Kruger process, right? Where before you know a lot about it, you can have confidence in it because you just don't know how much stuff you don't know. And then as you learn more, you become aware how much you don't know. If you really stay attuned to how much stuff is there, like peruse more scientific journals, and just look at how many words all the cutting edge stuff is being talked about that you just have no idea what the fuck they're talking about at all. I don't know what this kind of proteomics is, and I don't know what this kind of transformer is, and I don't know what this kind of metafluid is, and I don't know. And just start to take in more of how much you have no idea about things. And the certainty gets replaced with both curiosity and humility and awe. And as a result, you start learning a lot more. And the fascinating thing is, you learn a lot more, so your views get more accurate and less certain at the same time. A world in which everybody worked to have a lot more epistemic rigor, and also is aware of how much they don't know, so there's still humility in every situation and conversation. That's a world that would actually be capable of some kind of democratic process working.
I just finished a video on why smart people believe stupid things. And it was all about cognitive bias and how to overcome it. And it's interesting. The video made a case that smart people are more prone to cling to really idiotic ideas because they can rationalize them better.
Yes.
And we made a case that the antidote to this cognitive bias was curiosity. The more
Yeah.
curious you are about things, the more it'll extinguish the cognitive bias. So, just being curious, it's a great way to live.
The smart person can rationalize. And the interesting thing is that rationalizing is the opposite of rationality, right? The idea of rationality is that we're taking some, like, hopefully clear, formal process of assessing the world. Rationalization is you come to a belief based on in-group identity or motivated reasoning or whatever types of things, and then you rationally backfill why you came there. But the reason that you say you came there and why you actually came there aren't the same, but you probably have low enough psychological insight that you don't realize that. And so one should be very, very attentive to their own rationalization and motivated reasoning. But the other thing is that the smart person, because they have an identity as a smart person, and maybe they they have a job as a smart person, supported by the people who support them to believe that stuff, because they speak to an audience on the left or an audience on the right who wants them to be the smart person who says those things. Or if they started saying more nuanced things, they would lose their support base. So it's not just that they're better capable of rationalizing. It might also be that they start to get success and identity associated with narrow applications of smart, just like narrow applications of progress.
It's like audience capture.
Audience capture, market capture, incentive capture, all those things.
Yeah, it's pretty big in the influencer world, where your audience is going to want a more extreme version of the character you're playing. And so you have to get more and more extreme. So then the question is, who's doing the influencing, you or the
Yeah.
audience?
Yeah. I would say that the spend more time in deathbed reflections, because you won't be stoked on having become that person, right? The person that it was not based on the most earnest understanding of reality, and not based on your deepest truth, but based on the appeal to more status and incentive, won't
Mm.
end up being the stuff you're proud of.
That's very deep. Yeah, I live right near a hospice, so I should probably walk on over there and just check in.
It's a really beautiful thing to do. This is actually one of the other things that I think is particularly tragic in our society. We talked about how in tribal society, the old people and the young people were the actual central axis, with the knowledge transfer and syncing being key. So obviously, we ship our old people out to nursing homes and whatever, where they're on lots of meds and put in front of a TV with the lowest cost workers taking care of them. And we ship our kids out to the same type of thing, a daycare and then a school with the lowest cost workers, because we only take care of our kids if we can't make more money than it costs us to pay for someone else to take care of our kids. Extending that further is the medicalization of birth and death, where most people haven't been to births and they haven't been with many people as they die. Again, in a tribal environment, everybody's with all the deaths, all the births. By the time a person is going into birth themselves, they've been with so many of them. They don't have the unknown and the fear around it. By the time someone's dying, they've been through the death of almost everybody they know, right? And they're the most sacred, beautiful experiences, and spending more time with them, it also, it contextualizes the shit that you think is so important that just isn't, and the kind of self-center. And so I would love more people to spend more time with the dying, and to spend more time with infants and little kids, and with birth and death itself. When you go to the hospice, you'll also notice that just because someone is old and dying does not mean they lived a life that gave them much wisdom. And you'll see that some people are approaching it with a lot of terror and regret and agony, and some people approach it with like tremendous grace and gratitude and beauty. And it does have to do with how they lived. And that's also a really important thing to watch and pay attention to.
Wow. Yeah, I'm I'm thinking a lot about these things lately. I recently just found out I'm going to be a dad.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so I've been, my priorities have really shifted, and now I
Hmm.
really got to get my act together.
Yes, congratulations.
Yeah,
Um,
thanks.
I don't think there's anything that I have ever seen that is generally as powerful for motivating someone to grow into their own values as parenting. If you're thoughtful enough to realize that your kid's going to get all your issues,
Yeah.
they're going to get your gifts, they're going to get your issues, they're going to get your blind spots, they're going to get your all those things, and that what you tell them will influence them less than who you are. And so if you tell them something you can't live, what they're really going to get is how you actually are, and then a sense of a lot of conflict and incongruence and shame from the disparity of the messages. And so if you're like, fuck, I really, and when they're little and very neuroplastic, they're never going to be that neuroplastic again. That doesn't mean there is not chance for healing and growth and redemption later. There is, but you're like, that time is very unique. And their first year, their first 3 years are so much more important to their life than those years are to you for your life, right? Like, you're not imprinting the core of your nervous system and how you're going to be for the rest of forever. They are. And so when you realize that, you're like, damn, I am not the most important thing to pay attention to. And so much of the stuff I couldn't overcome for my own purpose, I have to overcome for them. So I hope a lot of insights and integrations for you in that time.
Oh man, thank you. I really appreciate it, and I'm going to take all your advice to heart, because it's left me with a lot of stuff to think about for sure.
I look forward to hear the follow-up thoughts, and maybe we'll come and do another conversation.